Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by CuriosityStream, an incredible and incredibly affordable place to watch thousands of non-fiction movies and shows. Got more on them in just a bit. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, hello there, I'm your host, Simon. This one, it's going to be a long one. I was considering breaking it up into two parts, but then I looked at the stats, and for some reason, contrary to all my understanding of YouTube, YouTube's weird, and I don't understand it that well, but that we did a very, very long episode on, oh my god, Simon, you just published this like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, and that did surprisingly well, and YouTube decided to monetize it, which is nice, because that means I actually get paid for all my work, and that means I can pay my writers and stuff, which is nice. So I was like, no, let's not divide it up into two, let's just do another Beast episode. I don't think it's going to be 3 hours, but it's definitely going to be over an hour, maybe over an hour and a half. 30 pages from David. Gonna be here all morning, let's go. Oh, it's Ed Kemper, did I say that? The words of the co-ed killer. This is the guy who was, God, there's that fantastic show. Have they got a new season of that yet? Mindhunter? With, is it Lawrence Fishburne? It is Lawrence Fishburne, right? And the other dude, the younger guy, who's less well known, but is also fantastic. And the woman from Fringe. Oh my god, it's such a good cast. It's such a good show. I like it a lot. It's so stylish. Anyway, speaking of that, let's get into the horror. It was Good Friday, April the 20th, 1973. Ed Kemper drove his 1969 hardtop two-door sedan to his apartment in Alameda, a town in San Francisco Bay Area in the state of California. By his own admission, the whole time, he was thinking about committing murder. Kemper shared the apartment with a male friend of his. He had been a little short on cash of late, so it was his friend who picked up the tab for most of the rent. That's nice, good friends. We're like, mate, where is your half? Where is your half?
I don't know.
When Ed arrived at the apartment, he looked in the mailbox to see if his workers' compensation check had arrived. It had, but it was only for $40 or $263 in today's money. Oh my god, inflation. 1973. $40 was $263 today. And I don't know, I've never lived through a period of super high inflation, but now I am.
Welcome to the jungle, baby.
And you see, I got a loan, a mortgage on a property, just literally the month before it more than doubled in interest rates. And I'm like, wow, my savings account now pays more than the interest on my mortgage, which is incredible. And I locked it in for 7 years, which I know Americans, you get these 30-year lock-in mortgages, which is just oh my God, I wish. But I locked it in for 7 years, and I was like, that is some incredibly good timing, fact boy.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Ed had expected it to be more. He got on the phone with the state office to see if they'd be sending him any more money. They weren't. Ed became agitated, but his friend told him to relax and not worry about it. His roommate said that he had the rent covered. No sweat. This was a kind gesture, but Ed began to feel like he was leeching off him, and so after a moment's contemplation, Ed resolved to move back in with his mother until his financial situation improved. That's not the sort of thing that you'd normally There's definitely a bit of a running theme with our criminals that we look at on this podcast, that they don't really have a lot of empathy or understanding for other people. But the fact that he's like, oh no, I'm leeching off you, I feel bad about that, is not a common trait in our little psychos that we look at, is it? Living with the mother as an adult, though, probably is. Ed Gein, anybody? Ed returned to his car and drove back to work. He might as well start racking up the hours as soon as possible. Although Ed was a very bright chap and could have gone to university, he'd opted to be a simple labourer for the California Division of Highways. Only 24 years old, Ed Kemper made for a strong and sturdy worker. He was a towering 6'9" tall, or 206 centimetres. Bloody hell, I knew he was tall, but I didn't realise he was that tall. That is a giant of a man. And Kemper wasn't a beanpole either. Although in 1973 he did not have the hefty load of fat that he'd gained in later life, he was strong and solidly built, weighing over 300 pounds or 136 kilograms. Weighing 136 kilograms and not being fat, you are a machine. In short, Kemper was a giant, and he intimidated a lot of people with his stature. Yet some people did refer to him as a gentle giant because of his polite and generally cooperative demeanor. Kemper was also clean-cut, unlike many of the hippie youth in California at the time, his brown hair cropped close, his only facial hair being a large, well-trimmed moustache, capping off the rather square look with a pair of granny glasses. It's gotta be interesting to be so tall and so massive, because it's like, I'm just going to dress how I want. Like, no one's going to pick on me because I am massive. You dressing like a nerd? Yes. What are the bullies going to do? Nothing, because I am an enormous man. After a few hours of work, Ed clocked out and drove south to Aptos, a small town not far away. He arrived at 609A Ord Drive, the house of his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, a 3-time divorcee, formerly named Turnquist, formerly Kemper, maiden name Stage. She had split from her latest husband, Harold Magnus Strandberg, 4 years earlier in 1969. Meanwhile, Clarnell easily supported herself as an administrative assistant for one of the provosts of the University of California, Santa Cruz. Politely knocking on the door, Ed found that Clarnell was not at home, so he used his spare key to let himself inside. Ed had lived with his mother for the majority of the past 3 years since he was released from a state hospital for the criminally insane. Oh my, that's a twist. Everything seems quite normal up until this point. He's a big man, he's working labor, he's smart and polite and kind, and he's also spent some time in a hospital for the criminally insane. Do they even say that anymore? I feel like a hospital for the criminally insane is the sort of thing... What's that song? That boy needs therapy. He's criminally insane. It sounds like something from the past, you know? Ed made his way into the kitchen. He felt terrible, or as he put it, quote, like a ticking time bomb. I felt that I was going to be caught pretty soon for the killing of those girls, or I was going to blow up and do something very open and get myself caught. A long time ago, I had thought about what I was going to do in the event I got myself caught, and the only choices I saw were just to accept it and go to jail, and let my mother carry the load, and let the whole thing fall into her hands like it did the last time with my grandparents. Or I could take her life. Wow. Okay, never mind. It's like, Simon, look how much empathy he's got. He's like, he doesn't want his roommate to pay all of the rent. And he's like, I could kill my mother. Holy Ed. Ed sat beside the telephone and made a couple of work-related calls before dialing the number of his mother's office at the university. Clarnell picked up. Ed informed her that he'd be moving back in with her for a bit until his monetary situation looked a little bit brighter. Doesn't he also see? He's like, yeah, I'm moving out. And it's like, mate, either way, I'm paying all of the rent. Although I guess his roommate can get a new roommate who might be able to help pay for it. Anyway, Clarnell's response was stony and curt, betraying only a hint of dismay at the news. She brusquely told him not to wait up because she'd be attending a work function at the university that evening, then would be going out to dinner and would not be home until late. And by late, she didn't mean 10:15. Clarnell was something of an alcoholic. She could be out all night. Kemper told her, he understood, and hung up the phone. In that situation, I can understand why she's curt. It's like, look, I'm sure when my kids have left home, I'll still love them. But if they want to come back and live with me, they're going to have to f***ing ask, to be honest. It's not just going to be like,
hey, Dad, just letting you know, I moved out of my apartment and I'm going to be living here for a while.
They'd be like, well, yes. There's a word you're missing, and it's please. Who raised you? Ed went out and got himself a 6-pack of beer, returned home, and then sat down and watched TV. He didn't eat, he just waited for his mother. To quote, I'd wish to talk to her, really, before anything happened. It was my hope that she would go on good terms. Well, I guess it would be on good terms, because we hadn't really argued or anything when we talked on the phone. Wait, is he just saying he wants to have a chat with his mum before he murders her? Again, holy Ed.
That's very thoughtful, friend.
Ed waited for his mother until midnight before turning off the TV and going to his old bedroom and falling asleep. He slept for 2 hours, waking up at 2 a.m. He went to his mother's bedroom to see if she'd gotten home. Her bed was empty. She was still out. Ed went back to sleep. He awoke again at 4 a.m., walked to his mother's bedroom to see if she was there. Clarnell was in bed, reading a book, one of those cheap trash novels she always had. She looked at Ed as he entered the room. What are you doing up? She asked. Nothing, just wanted to make sure you were home, Ed replied. Clarnell then said sarcastically, oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now. A ripple of hatred coursed through Ed. Tears welled up and stung at the corner of his eyes. It was at that moment he knew for certain that he was going to kill her. This is one of those interesting situations where this guy is a serial killer, but he clearly has emotions. Like, he's not your typical, psychopath, just has been abused. Maybe he has. Well, I guess we'll find out more. Maybe he's been abused. All of this stuff that is like, or he's just born, without emotions or whatever, or, the empathy and such. And it's just like, no. He's just, his emotions are all like messed up. No, Ed replied. Well, we'll talk in the morning, Clarnell declared, ignoring the fact that it was already 4 a.m. You know what's weird? It's like, yeah, we'll talk in the morning. You don't reply, it is the morning, unless you're a tool. If morning means like breakfast. Fine, good night, Ed answered. He then turned on his heel and went back to bed. But he did not go back to sleep. To quote, I lay there in bed, thinking about killing her. It's something hard to just up and do. I had the most insane reason for going and killing your mother. Someone just standing off to the side, watching, isn't really going to see any kind of sense or rhyme or reason. There was times when she was and yelling at me that I felt like retaliating and walking over to the telephone in her presence and calling the police to say, hello, I'm the co-ed killer, just to lay it on her. But I had done some things and I felt that I had to carry the full weight of what had happened. I certainly wanted for my mother to have a nice, quiet, easy death. Like I guess everyone wants. Yeah, or they don't want death. They don't want to be murdered. They just want to die when they're old in their sleep. Kemper laid in his bed until 5:15 a.m. when he could be certain that his mother had long since fallen asleep. Quote, I went to the kitchen and got a claw hammer. I picked up my pocket knife, opened it and carried it in my right hand and the hammer in my left. I walked into the bedroom very quietly. She was sound asleep, then she moved a little bit and I thought she was waking up. I waited and waited, but she just lay there. So I approached her right side. I stood there a couple of minutes, and then I hit her with a hammer just above the temple on the right side of her head. I struck with a very hard blow, and I believe I dropped the hammer or laid it down or something. Immediately after striking the blow, I looked for a reaction. There really wasn't one. Blood started running down her face from the wounds, and she was still breathing. I could hear the blood running into her windpipe. It was obvious I had done severe damage to her, because in other cases I had shot people in the head, and I heard the same effect of blood running into the breathing passages. All of this happened in a few seconds, dude. That is properly grim. And that is like not, it's like, yeah, this is how all people want to die. A hammer blow to the head. Blunt force trauma. That's it. No, that's not how people want to die in their sleep, Ed, you psycho. Kemper then rolled his mother onto her back. He held up her chin with his right hand, and bearing the knife in his left, he slashed his mother from ear to ear across her throat. Clarnell began to bleed out. Then Kemper inserted the knife deep into his mother's neck and began to saw away at the flesh. Oh my lord. Moving in a circular motion around the back of her head, returning to the front. After a jagged line of broken skin and sinew separated the head from the rest of his mother's body, with a sharp crack, Kemper broke off Clarnell's neck and ripped her head clean off. The mild-mannered wouldn't hurt a fly, Ed Kemper, ripping his mother's head off. Jesus Christ. The whole decapitation took no more than 30 seconds. Kemper was very experienced at cutting women's heads off. Oh, I don't remember how brutal this was. I know he's in that Mindhunter show, so it's like, yeah, they're literally studying him because he's a serial killer and just one of the worst. But I forgot how bad it gets, because you kind of hear him talk and you're like, oh yeah, not too bad. And then it's like, no, oh god, the sinew, the blood filling the, dude.
Are you okay, boss?
Kemper proceeded, oh god, I forgot about this. Yeah, I forgot about the necrophilia on his own mother. Jesus. Kemper proceeded to insert his penis into the mouth of his mother's decapitated head in an act of neurotic fellatio. He then did a similar act with a hole at the base of his mother's neck. Oh my god. Quote, I'm not a lizard. I'm not from under a rock. I came out of her vagina, you see. I came out of my mother, and in a rage, I went right back in. For 7 years, she said, I have not had sex because of you, my murderous son. This was one of our arguments, and so I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse. Oh my god, that is super I mean, obviously, Ed Kemper, like, beyond insane. Like, what the are you doing? But also his mum, to say that to him, is also like, well, she was pretty as well, and she definitely did a solid job of him up, for sure. Then, in a symbolic act, Kemper cut out his mother's tongue and vocal cords. He took them into the kitchen and put them down the garbage disposal. The vocal cords, however, were so tough in their texture that the garbage disposal spat out chunks of them into the sink. Kemper was amused and thought, quote, that seemed appropriate, as much as she had and screamed and yelled at me over so many years. No. Kemper then placed his mother's head on a shelf and screamed abuse at it for an hour. Then he threw darts at it. Then he bludgeoned Clarnell's head until he had smashed in her face. You couldn't... If someone wrote this as a screenplay, it'd be like, no, it's too much. It's just unrealistic. You know, it'd be like, you've gone too far. Think more American Psycho. That was just how far you could go. It's like, no, the reality is worse. Kemper returned to his mother's body in the bedroom. Clarnell Strandberg was a big woman, 6 feet tall or 183 centimeters, with her head attached, weighing approximately 225 pounds or 102 kilos. As such, Ed Kemper clasped a pair of handcuffs to his headless mother's wrists so he could pull her using the chain out of bed, across the bedroom floor, and into the closet. Kemper closed the door on his mother's body, concealing it. He then proceeded to clean the bed sheets, flip over the mattress so the blood stain wouldn't be visible, wipe the blood spatter from the walls, and shampoo the slug trail of blood on the bedroom carpet. By mid-morning, the bedroom looked good as new, as if nothing untoward had ever happened in there. Well, I'll tell you a couple of things, Ed. One, you're shampooing the carpet. You can't just flip over a mattress and hope that blood pool is going to disappear. It's going to start to smell. Also, your mum's body is in the closet, mate. You're going to do something about that. The head is in the kitchen. The vocal cords are in the garbage disposal. Good Lord, man. It was at that point that Kemper became physically ill and thought that he couldn't remain a single minute longer in the house. He had to go and have a drink at a local bar, his head a complete mess. Quote, "I still loved my mother, and it's hard for somebody to comprehend that you murder your mother through love. It isn't a rational process. It's a very painful process, and I've still got to live with that. 6 young women dead because of the way she raised her son, and the way he grows up." And what are her closing words? "I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk. God, I wish I had." I am willing to proportion a decent amount of blame for how messed up you are, Ed, to your mother. However, how about a little bit of self-ownership? Like, we're all a product of our environments, but we're also, I don't know, you can't blame everything on other people, because there's lots of people who had shitty upbringings who I'm sure had a much shittier upbringing than you, and turned out to be possibly troubled, but non-murderous members of society. Some probably turned out totally fine. And yeah, you've got to own some of it, my dude. You can't just be like, it's her fault. You've murdered many people. You put your in your dead mother's mouth. Some of that, mate, is on you. Now, let me interrupt today's video to tell you a little bit about today's fantastic sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a place where you can watch thousands of non-fiction movies and shows. It's all sorts of smart stuff. And look, you're watching a true crime show here on YouTube, so I've got a recommendation for you. Why not check out Murder Maps? This looks at historical murder cases at different locations and in different times throughout history. There's also cool recreations in it, so they have actors playing things out, and really good storytelling overall. So if you're enjoying this show, definitely check out Murder Maps. There are currently 5 seasons. So, I mean, for me, there's nothing worse than checking out a new show and it's like, oh yeah, 1 season from like 2018, and then you just know it's been cancelled and there are 5 episodes and that's it. Not so with Murder Maps. They got 5 seasons for you to check out, which is brilliant. CuriosityStream is pretty much available on any streaming device like Roku, Apple TV, Chromecast. If you've got a device with a screen, you're probably going to be able to watch it. It's also available worldwide, no geo restrictions. They're also adding cool new stuff every week. I went to look and see what they released recently, and well, there's always just a whole new bunch of stuff to add to your queue. You'll never run out. So go to curiositystream.com/criminalist. You'll get unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And for you guys, just use the promo code criminalist and you'll get 25% off, which comes out to only $14.99 a year, which that's $1.25 a month, which is insane. I know what I pay for unnamed competitor service, and it's a hell of a lot more than that. And CuriosityStream has a ton of great stuff for yeah. If you like this non-fiction sort of stuff on YouTube, you're gonna love it. That's CuriosityStream. Thank you to them. And now back to the show. Meet the Kempers. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December the 18th, 1948 in Burbank, California. He was the middle child of 3 children born to Edmund Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Kemper. The baby's father was 6'8" or 203 centimeters tall, which paired well with Clarnell's already considerable 6-foot frame. This resulted in baby Ed being born weighing 13 pounds or 5.9 kilograms. That is a big baby.
That's why you're such a little bastard.
From the beginning, he was destined to be a giant. Ed III had 2 sisters, Susan, who was born almost 6 years earlier in 1943, and Alan, who was born 2.5 years after Ed in 1951. His father, Edmund Jr., had served in the US Special Forces during the Second World War, sometimes taking assignments that were described as suicide missions. After being honorably discharged, Edmund Jr. transitioned to civilian life as an electrician, at which he made a decent living. His wife, Clarnell, however, snidely described her husband's new profession as quote-unquote menial. Jesus, snob butch. Theirs was not a happy marriage. What a surprise. If you'd chosen a career and your wife was like, that's a menial job, be like, I don't like you. You're mean. Between 1953 and 1955, when Ed was between the ages of 4 and 6 years old, Ed's father departed for the Pacific Proving Grounds to take part in various atom bomb tests, leaving Clarnell to raise the 3 children alone. Ed's father would later say of his wife that, quote, suicide missions in wartime in the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her. She does sound like a challenge. I mean, like, oh no, I've got to go and do this thing with the military with the atom bombs really far away from you for a really long time. Oh no. And that his marriage to Clarnell did more damage to his mental health than, quote, more than 396 days and nights fighting on the front did. Yeah. And the Second World War was no picnic. In Ed's own words, his mother had, quote, a very strong and violently outspoken position on men. My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. Clarnell considered most men to be boorish and stupid. She thought that all men had controlled the world for much of history by sheer brute force, and that the world, in fact, would be much better run by women. She thought men's sexuality came from an entirely negative place, filled with savage and primitive desires, and that to some degree, romance and marriage simply legitimized the rape and enslavement of women. Okay. Your takes went from, like, progressive to, well, slightly insane. If you don't want to get married, don't get married. It's your free choice. And I'm just going to go out there and say, I bet like 99% of women are getting married out of their free choice. I mean, not let's just discount the crazy parts of the world where they, stone people to death. But like for the most part, women are getting married by their own free will. Right? I'm in a marriage. I'm pretty sure I had to ask. She also thought that men were fundamentally weak creatures compared to women and pathetically could not live up to the moral and ethical standards set for them. Clarnell also chafed at traditional gender roles and the marriage in which she found herself in the 40s and 50s in America. To quote her son, father worked and he brought in a big paycheck. We had a nice house, we went to school, we had birthdays, we had Christmas, we had vacations. He had Saturday night with his poker buddies in the guest house by the garage. We were living pretty good. And she absolutely hated that. The stereotypical response of this deadhead, this buttonhead she was married to, of wanting to go out and play cards in a smoke-filled room, drinking beer with his old war buddies. I mean, this, I have to say, like, I'm also not one for, like, super, like, old-school gender roles, traditional bullshit. But it's also like, well, you sound like a really difficult woman, and playing cards and having a beer with your friends. I loved having a beer with my friends in a smoke-filled room. Like, I also love my wife and I spend most of the time with her. But also, if she was super mean like this woman seems, I'd be like, nah, just rather just have a drink with my friends. Jesus. Ed recalled that his mother showered his father with frequent downpours of verbal abuse, belittling his intelligence and emasculating him whenever possible. And you're like, why does he love drinking? Why does he like hanging out with his friends? Oh, I don't know. Maybe because you're a This resulted in endless rows between the two of them, where Clarnell goaded her husband with stinging remarks until he was insensible with rage and stormed out. He was never physically violent with her. Clarnell's disdain and verbal abuse also extended to her son from an early age, calling him stupid and useless, completely eviscerating the young boy's self-esteem to the point that he'd just meekly do as he was told. Quote, I had no faith in myself at all. I was not an individual. Some experts now speculate that Clarnell may have suffered from borderline personality disorder, which may explain a treatment of her family, though I'm not entirely sold on this diagnosis since it was conducted entirely post-mortem and is mostly dependent on Ed's depiction of her. Yeah, I mean, it's like, obviously there are mental conditions and stuff, but there's also just being a or being a again, it just comes... I realize I'm walking like a fine line here because I don't want to say that someone who's got a mental condition and is a dickhead because of their mental condition, that's not an excuse. But there's also a degree of self-own. Everything's a scale, right? It's not like yes or no. It's going to be a scale of grey all the way from like full on has this condition to full on does not. And then there's everything in between. And at some point, there's got to be more self-ownership, doesn't there? I feel like that is not an unreasonable thing to say. Like, this woman seems very mean, and you can't just chalk that all up to her not being right in the head. I feel like you've got to, like, I don't know. Is self-ownership such a bad thing? Ownership of your own problems and issues? I don't know. I feel I'm treading fine line here, but anyway. When Ed was 8 years old, his father came home from work one evening and was shocked to discover that Clarnell had sent their son out earlier that day selling newspapers, telling the boy not to come back until every copy of the paper was sold. Ed had been missing all day, and it was getting dark. His father searched the neighborhood, and after a couple of hours, he found Ed sitting miserably next to a stack of newspapers, desperately trying to sell them so his mother would let him come home. Ed's dad sounds like a really... I'm in Ed's dad camp. He sounds like a good dude. Anyway, it would appear that Clarnell's abuse of Ed was mimicked by his older sister, Susan. When Ed was 4 and Susan was 10, she tried to push him in front of a train. Holy dude. When Ed was 5 and Susan was 11, she threw him into the deep end of a swimming pool and he nearly drowned. When Ed was 8 and Susan was 14, she invited him into her bed and sexually molested him. Oh my god. We've just gone from like holy to holy so, oh my god, what are you doing? This is like, don't your kids for sake.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
On a similar note, when Ed was 10 years old while visiting New York City, he was also molested by a male cousin. What is going on in your family, my dudes? Come on.
Cut my life into pieces!
How about just a little bit less molestation? I'm not saying no molestation. Just less. No, I mean, no would be best. That was a joke. As a lad, Ed joined the Boy Scouts, where he learned many of the wilderness survival skills and methods for concealing burials that would serve him well as a murderer years later. Pro tip there, if you want to be a criminal. Wilderness survival. I do feel like wilderness survival people are probably more likely to be murderers as well. I don't know why, they just got that vibe, don't they? I mean, I love it. Like, I'm a big fan. There was this TV show called Ray Mears Extreme Survival or whatever it was called when I was a kid. He was like Bear Grylls, but less piss drinking and more sensible. And it was this great show where he'd go into the jungle and he'd make like camps and stuff and he'd catch little fishes and it was awesome. And I love that stuff. But I do feel it's also like more, the good dude who lives in the woods, sort of like Unabomber style, is more likely to, you know, cut someone's heart out and eat it, right? Especially if you're like a survivalist. If you've got a bunker, I also feel you're more likely to be a murderer. They just feel like, you know, that Venn diagram is going to overlap more than the like person who loves crochet, right? For some reason. Just maybe it's the love of knives and guns. What are we talking about? Oh yeah, molestation. At summer camp, a visiting member of the National Rifle Association taught Ed how to use and maintain a gun. While this is the stuff of an all-American boy in the 1950s, Ed did not relate easily to other children, was socially stunted and generally inept. The other kids often made fun of his awkward mannerisms, shy and docile nature, and abnormally large size. Ed demonstrated low self-esteem and even suicidal ideation at a young age. To quote, "One of my favorite tricks back then was to lay in front of cars in traffic. Now I'm walking down the sidewalk with a friend and we're clowning around and I'll say, 'Hey, check this out.' And I'll go lay in the street, like a stiff. I'd lay like I got run over and a car comes driving by and of course I'm expecting this guy isn't drunk. I'm expecting this guy isn't slightly demented and I'll say, 'Hey, there's a kid lying in front of me. Hey, it's another guy's fault.' Thump thump. And then shift gears, driving right over me. But they were, what the are you thinking about, Ed? Also, I'm really struggling with your, like, I know this is often one of those things where it's like, this is obviously a transcript of spoken words. Really hard to read sometimes. But they always stopped, and they get out of the car and get all upset when I'd get up and walk away. But it was a little game we played. My friends didn't lay in front of the cars, though. I was doing that. It indicated, I think, how little I thought of myself, that a part of me would rather I got run over right then than continue my life, because looking at myself and how I was developing inside, nothing good could come of that. Similarly, at the age of 10, when Ed was visiting New York City, he climbed over the protective railing at the top of the Empire State Building and had to be pulled back down by his panicked aunt. Again, for Ed, this wasn't just stupid or mindless behavior. He had a legitimate and deeply rooted disregard for his own life, his own worth as a human being, and in many ways, he thought it would be better for him if he did not live anymore. We now know that Ed Kemper was born a congenital psychopath. Wait, I mean, I know it's like a complicated definition and all that stuff, but he does seem to have like a lot of emotions, and emotions close to the surface. Like many serial killers on The Casual Criminalist, Ed Kemper was one of those 1 to 5% of people neurologically incapable of feeling empathy for others. So what's up with him feeling about him leeching off his friend? That does feel, that is empathy, isn't it? I mean, it could be manufactured empathy, so he can think about it in a more calculated way. But it didn't feel like that. And I guess like when he got all teary-eyed because his mum was mean to him. That's not empathy. That's just, feeling for yourself. But it doesn't feel very psychopathy. But again, not an expert. Casual criminalist, not criminalist. As such, he had difficulty figuring out how to make friends, or even what one did with them once one had them. But unlike many serial killers, like Ted Bundy, for example, Ed Kemper did not suffer from a corresponding narcissistic personality disorder, which forms another third of the so-called dark triad, since his ego had been thoroughly obliterated by his mother during childhood. As with the final third of the dark triad, Kemper did exhibit early signs of Machiavellian thinking and selfish dishonesty, as he, quote, came up with devious ways to get around the rules of the household. This ability to lie and conceal the darker side of his personality continued into adulthood. Kemper did not, however, lie compulsively or erratically lie like some serial killers and notorious conmen. He was always very deliberate and organized in his deceptions, only lying when he felt he had to. The dark triad is so interesting. The narcissism, the psychopathy, and the Machiavellianism. It's like, there's tests you could do for this, right? I wonder, I don't know where I'd fall. Because also, when you're doing the test, you're like, oh, I know, do I tick this box? I kind of feel this way, but I know that's the wrong answer. It's like, do you think you're awesome? Yes, yes, but no.
You are awesome.
Meanwhile, Ed's psychopathy was severe enough that enough people noticed to get creeped out by him. Like many psychopaths, Ed had no concept that he had been staring at someone too long. As such, he'd look at people quietly without saying anything until they got upset. Kemper did this habitually. He had difficulty relating to friends and also having healthy interactions with girls, a deficiency exacerbated by denigration and shaming inflicted by his mother. As a preteen, a girl who Ed liked tried pressuring him into physical intimacy, and he panicked and rejected her. Quote, she was pretty aggressive, a beautiful young girl, but I wasn't ready for that kind of relationship and I was scared by it. She kind of cowed me into backing away from the relationship. She wanted to kiss and neck and smooch and imitate what she saw in older kids. And that kind of terrified me, because I didn't understand the feelings inside. Like many psychopaths, Ed also did not try very hard at school, and was constantly skipping class, despite the fact that he was later determined to have an IQ of between 136 and 148, which is very high. That is very, very smart. Where's genius level? Late 30s? Ed also exhibited the classic signs of violent psychopathy by fantasizing about the murder, torture, and abuse of other people and actively inflicting harm on small animals. He was pulling the legs off insects at a very early age, or trapping them inside bottles and stabbing them with sharp implements. At the age of 7, he stole his father's wartime bayonet, snuck out of the house at night, and watched his second-grade teacher through the windows of her house. When Ed... Dude. This is like... when he starts killing cats and we need to get him to a psychiatrist. Maybe do that already. Yeah. Don't be like pulling the legs off insects and just standing outside your teacher's window. It's pretty worrying behavior, dude. When Ed was 8, he confided in his older sister, Susan, that he had a crush on her school teacher. She teased him, "Oh, why don't you kiss her?" To which Ed replied, "I can't. I'd have to kill her first." Uh-oh, that's another warning sign. Or it's like, what's he up to? Oh yeah, he's killed a cat. And he said that he would have to murder a woman before he kissed her. Dude, no. At age 10, Ed killed a cat by burying it alive. Well, there we go. Once it had suffocated to death, Ed dug it up, brought it into the house. In his room, he cut off the cat's head and stuck it on a makeshift pike so that he could look at it. Ed then disposed of the cat's remains and felt a sense of pleasure that he managed to successfully deceive his family about it. That's all sorts of up, dude. Around the same age, Ed was playing around with a cap gun and in an argument had it broken by his younger sister, Alan. In retaliation, Ed stormed into her room, popped off the head of her Barbie doll, and realizing the head could just be reattached, he took a pair of scissors and cut off the doll's hands. After handing it back to his 7-year-old sister, he said, quote, "Here, now you've got a toy that doesn't work too, and I don't have a toy that works too good." After that incident, Ed developed a taste for mutilating toy dolls, and it became a sort of ritual for him. I have to say, of all the worrying behavior, I don't know, I feel I probably did that to my sister's toys as a kid. It should be like, you broke my toy, so I broke yours. I'm not sure I'd cut the hands off. That is a bit psycho. But, kids being kids, that is not burying a cat, waiting for it to suffocate, taking it to your room, cutting its head off, and sticking it on a pike. There is a big difference between those two activities. At age 13, Ed shot a dog that belonged to another boy in the neighborhood. Ed did so for no other reason than to see what it would be like. If someone shoots a dog and then you ask, why did you shoot the dog? And they're like, I wanted to know what it was like to shoot a dog. Oh my good lord, let's just start figuring out the cocktail of drugs that you need to take, like ASAP. After that, he became a social pariah and was bullied and physically threatened by a mob of teenage boys. Already standing at 6'4", none of them dared threaten him one-on-one, but at one point, the threats nearly turned into a lynching, and Ed had to flee to a nearby house where a woman had to call the police to disperse the crowd of angry teens. Oh my god. When you are such a crazy, dog-murdering, cat-burying psycho that a gang of people get together to chase after you and beat you up, why is someone not stepping in at this point and putting him in a special school or putting him in with I don't know, whoever looks after people like this? I know it's back in the day, but still, come on. That same year, when Ed was 13, he was in his bedroom sharpening a knife and his father's machete. He observed the family cat, a Siamese, asleep in a nearby chair. Ed disliked it because it seemed to favor his younger sister, Alan, and she didn't respond to his attempts to train it. Yeah, it's a cat, mate. And also, it's not going to like you because it's probably well, you cut off the head of my mate, didn't you? You psycho. He's like, why don't you like me, cat? Because I can see the cat skull on your shelf. You weirdo. Why would I like you? You're just going to cut my head off. Ed picked up the cat by the scruff of its neck, took the machete, and cut off the top of the cat's skull so the brain was exposed. Oh my god. The cat started to have a seizure. Ed then took his knife and stabbed the cat multiple times in the ribs and stomach. He then dissected it and buried the majority of the cat in the backyard, keeping some of the cat's intestines wrapped up in an old shirt in his closet. When his mother later found those remains... Please tell me the next line is she called the emergency helpline for crazy people and got him committed. Please, good lord, please. She asked him where they'd come from and if it had something to do with the cat's disappearance. Ed, not very convincingly, lied about the intestines and denied harming the cat. We know you did it, Ed! On his harming of animals, Ed later said, quote, "It's not for me to judge these mental health professionals, but when they look at me here on Monday morning after the football game and they say, gee, here's all these little parts of the puzzle, oh well, harming animals indicates what he was going to do. And if that's the case, I want to know about the teenage kids or the preteen kids who are going through these raging moods and attitudes that go out and kill neighborhood cats and hang them up from a telephone pole or hang them from a tree, shoot them full of arrows and set fire to them. Where are those children today? Are they serial killers? Or are they police chiefs and mayors and aldermen and assemblymen? Ed, what are you talking about? You're smart. So I'm just trying to decipher what you're actually saying because it probably makes sense. Just because he's smart doesn't mean it's going to make sense because obviously he's a psycho. But what's he getting at here? He's kind of saying that not all people who torture animals grow up to be psychos, and it's no, sure, but it definitely is an indicator, Ed. People should have looked at that. To answer Ed's question, in case anyone is curious, not all psychopaths, even those who harm animals in childhood, go on to become killers. Of the roughly 1 in 100 people who display all the signs of psychopathy and the 1 in 20 people who display some of the signs, many become functioning psychopaths in the same way that one can be a functioning alcoholic. Their lack of empathy, their ruthlessness and impulsiveness do not bring them into trouble with the law, or at least they don't get caught. In some professions, being a psychopath can actually be a positive asset, and psychopaths tend to cluster towards careers as businessmen, lawyers, politicians, media personalities. No! No, David! I am sort of a businessman and a media personality. I also studied law. Salespeople, haven't done that. Sort of. I worked on the phone as a sales, but oh god, surgeons, journalists, police officers, religious leaders, chefs, and civil servants. Well, okay, that's also a huge number of people because that's a lot of career paths. Essentially, any career that has a high level of influence and social status that could be potentially lucrative and requires a high level of confidence, a somewhat cutthroat attitude, and ability to divorce themselves from the harm and distress they may cause other human beings in the course of their duties.
Simon is an unusual subject.
Oh, good lord. Yeah. I do something that I suppose has a fairly high level of influence, and social status these days. I don't really feel like what I do. It's weird that it has social status, but I guess it does. It's definitely lucrative. Does require a high level of confidence. I don't think it really requires a cutthroat attitude. And it's what I quite like about making podcasts and YouTube. There's loads of people and they're all successful. In another business, if you're selling widgets, and Jeff across the street is selling widgets. Jeff is your competition. And I don't know, I look at the other like shows like this and true crime and stuff, and it's like, I don't know, I don't really see it. It's like there's loads of viewers. Everyone like is watching loads of stuff. I don't really feel it's like competition. It's just like people who do it as well, which is nice. I like that. It's less intense that way. Although I don't really feel why are we doing an analysis of my job here? This isn't really what we're here for. I was just fascinated by the correlations. But of the roughly 1 in 100 people who are psychopaths and exist all around us, including many people you know, including the few thousand psychopaths watching this video.
I won't name names. You know who you are.
That is intense, right? Only a tiny percentage of them become killers. According to FBI estimates, somewhere between 1 in 500,000 people to a maximum 1.2 in 100,000 people become the classic serial killing monsters like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy. To put it in other terms, there are 4,000 classic type serial killers currently living in the United States today. Oh my god, that is so many. That is so many. Some of them are already in prison, others are still at large, or to put it another way, London and in the United Kingdom has a population of roughly 9 million people, meaning there are between 18 and 75 classic serial killers potentially roaming the streets there. Or to put it another way, there's a statistically good chance at least one serial killer watches this video. I think it's higher, to be honest. I think serial killers probably are more likely to watch videos about serial killers. So if statistically, if I make a video about, I don't know, whatever bullshit that's not related to crime, I don't know, I've got a lot of other channels, make a video about the space shuttle, then it's like, okay, there's maybe one person. But if it's a video about a serial killer, I'm going to say it's higher. I reckon there's probably more than one serial killer letting us know. Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to leave your name and address for the FBI. We cover a lot of predators on the Casual Criminalist, but it is almost certain that there are monsters out there quietly taking lives who will never be caught. 100%. I don't think we're catching the majority of them, to be honest. I think the majority of the ones we catch are the ones of like uncommonly good police work, or uncommonly stupid people. If you're really smart, I think you'll probably just continue to get away with it, to be honest, sadly. The fruits of maternal abuse. To quote, "Very early, my natural parents were always loud and arguing, which terrified me emotionally of anything loud and pushy. As I was growing up, I shied away from loud noises and arguments. My mother was very strong, and she wanted a man who was strong. My father was very big and very loud, but he was very weak, and she wanted the opposite. You know, wooing and dating. You're one thing, but after you're married, you let it all hang out. She was just too powerful. She would drive the men in her life away, attack them verbally, attack their manhood." Ed's father walked out in 1957 when Ed was still 8 years old. Clarnell and Ed Kemper Jr. began a formal separation. Clarnell moved her 3 children from Burbank, California to Helena, Montana, where she got a job as a secretary at First National Bank. Quote, "My mother started drinking heavily. She was working to raise 3 kids. We were not being cooperative about it. She drank more. She punished us harder, probably out of desperation. So character sets were being developed at that point." Clarnell's abuse of Ed became more intense once she had the boy to herself. This mostly came in the form of constant and withering verbal abuse. Occasionally her abuse did, however, become physical, particularly after she had been drinking. She told Ed that he was just like his father and that no woman would ever love him. She made fun of his looks. Once in a telephone call to his father, Ed overheard her call him a real weirdo, and she did not show him any affection or tender loving care because she thought it would, quote, "turn him gay." To Ed, his life with Clarnell was a living hell. As he later said, quote, "My mother was there to beat me. She was there to humiliate me. She was there to use me as an example of how inferior men are." Wow, this is this perfect combination, isn't it? You have someone who is born in that small percentage of people who are like classic psychopaths, and then also raised in an environment which turns them into monsters. So that's great. Well done, Clarnell, on that one.
Congratulations.
Yet Clarnell also seemed to have picked up on the very real signs that Ed might become dangerous one day and was justifiably concerned with some of his behavior. She feared Ed might harm his sisters. Part of this was also colored by her opinion that men in general were nothing more than deviants and predators, and her response to these concerns only made things worse. In 1957, when Ed was still only 8 years old, she forced him to sleep in the rat-infested basement while Clarnell and her daughters slept in the upstairs bedrooms. Quote, "The basement looked like a dungeon out of a castle or something. I was very susceptible. My imagination was very vivid, and there was an old furnace in the basement that had been converted from burning coal to burning gas. If you ever lived in a home like that, you know the binging, the clanging, the rattles, the pops, the weird sounds at night could be spooky to a kid. Well, at a certain time in the evening, the family left the living room of the house. My mother and my sisters would go upstairs to bed, where I used to go to bed. I had to go down to the basement, and an 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reason in that. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, they're going to heaven. Earth is the living room, and I'm going down to deal with demons and monsters and ghosts and all the things that scare me. They don't have to. If you can imagine me going down a staircase of rough-hewn wood, there's no guardrail. One step wrong, and you're off into this black pit. It's pitch black ahead of me. The only light is behind me, hanging down from the ceiling. I walk these gradients of light into complete darkness, groping around, and I've got this horrible terror going on inside of me. And this is every night." This is just... I know. Why are we expecting good parenting at any point? But Jesus, why? Why? Who broke you, Clarnell? In 1958, after the child spent 8 months living like this, his father came to visit his family in Montana. It was then he discovered that Ed had been forced to sleep in a windowless basement populated by rats. To quote Ed's father, he was terrified of the place. There was only one way out. Someone had to move the kitchen table and lift the trapdoor. I put a stop to it and threatened Clarnell with the law. From that point forward, Ed was returned to his upstairs bedroom. Good, but oh my God, can't you just take Ed? Can't you just take him? Because his mother is horrible. She's a horrible mother anyway, but she's a particularly horrible mother to her son because she thinks men are so horribly terrible. So please, come on, just take him and go live with him. That would be much better. It's no coincidence that it was only after Ed's parents separated and the abuse from his mother intensified that his most troubling behaviors, killing cats and dogs, fantasizing constantly about murder, began. He started keeping a death list that had a fantasy about everyone in the world dying and him having the run of the place, all the cars, all the food in the stores, with no rules or authority figures, no mother. When that fantasy became boring, he imagined that people were still around, but were frozen in place, like statues, entirely helpless, which he could do with as he pleased. It was a direct result of his mother's abuse that Ed's fantasies were drawn toward harming women, rather than men. Yeah, because she set up this crazy dichotomy of women being good and men being evil, like two sides of a battle. So of course he's gonna be on that other side, and it's just such a f***ed up thing to do to a kid. Clarnell and Ed's father officially got divorced in September 1961 when Ed was still 12 years old. 2 months later, Ed's father married another woman who already had a son from a previous marriage who was 14. They lived together in Van Nuys, California. Meanwhile, back in Montana, Ed felt that he had been replaced in his father's affections. In February 1962, Clarnell married her second husband, 45-year-old Norman Turnquist, a meat packer in a factory. Norman tried his best to bond with young Ed, taking him fishing and hunting and other male bonding exercises. Ed, however, despised his stepfather, and at one point he claims he fantasized about bludgeoning Turnquist with an iron bar when the old man had his back turned. But Ed did not follow through with this thought because he feared the threat of the older man's physical retaliation. Clarnell and Turnquist divorced a year and 4 months later in June 1963, with Turnquist claiming extreme cruelty. He died of a heart attack 2 years later. Yeah, of course. She literally caused him to get a divorce because of extreme cruelty, and then he died of a heart attack. I mean, holy shit, women, what are you doing? During the summer of 1963, when Ed was 14, his mother permitted him to go to California to visit his father. Ed desperately asked his dad if he could stay for good. His father agreed, excellent, knowing all about Clarnell's abusive habits, and enrolled Ed in a school for the coming autumn. But Ed's father began to notice his son's increasingly disturbing traits. He would leer at people and not look away. He displayed marked cruelty towards animals. His new wife also felt extremely uncomfortable around Ed. He would never leave the house, and he would always be lurking around someplace. She once caught Ed peering at her while she was naked in the bedroom. Ed would later claim that he had done this deliberately as a come-on. In early September 1963, Ed had only been in school for a week when his father sent him back to Montana, claiming that he could not afford to keep him on in California. This was a flimsy lie, and Ed knew it. Yeah, Ed Sr., this was your one chance. I'm not saying you could have turned things around, but you could have taken a crack at it. You could have been like, Ed, mate, we need to have a bit of a father-son sit down. Look, this is a little bit weird, isn't it, my dude? You need to not stare at people. You need to be less creepy, and in a positive way. I always think of Dexter, and I know it's a fictional TV show, But he was born like a psycho, and he had that crazy childhood trauma, and then his adoptive dad was like, I'm going to do something about this. And I'm not saying that's a realistic thing because it's a TV show, but at least take a crack at it. I mean, not turning him into a serial killer, but turning him, teaching him how to pretend to be normal. Nevertheless, 2 months later, in November 1963, Ed stole his mother's car, drove it to Butte, Montana, where he got on a bus back to California to be with his dad. Again, taking pity on Ed for his nightmarish home life back in Helena, his father agreed that he could stay. But a month later at Christmas, Ed's father took him to visit his paternal grandparents. He lived on a ranch near the Sierra Nevada mountains in the middle of nowhere, 2 miles west of the small town of North Fork. Then Ed's father left Ed behind to live permanently with his aging grandparents. He changed and delisted his phone number so Ed couldn't even call. Again, Ed felt rejected and betrayed. Although, honestly, anything is better than going back to, psycho mum. Right, Ed? It's got to be better to live on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. That sounds kind of nice. You could probably even kill animals and not be thought of a psycho for it, like chickens and cows, and then eat them. Maybe your grandparents will sort you out. They won't. This is Ed Kemper. We know he goes on to become a serial killer, but we can dream. When Clarnell heard the news that Ed had been left with his paternal grandparents, she contacted her ex-husband in California and said, "You're taking a huge chance leaving him with your parents. You might be surprised to wake up some morning to learn they have been killed." For all of her many faults and abuses against husband and children, Clarnell knew something was deeply wrong with her son. Yeah, partly she caused it, and then she made it much worse. Ed's grandmother, Maud Kemper, was 66 years old and wrote children's books and dabbled at being an artist. His grandfather, Edmund Kemper Sr., aged 72, was a retired laborer with the California Division of Highways. He now did his best to farm their 7-acre ranch, but he was suffering from dementia. Ed III, now aged 15, thought that Maud was a lot like his mother in that she was, quote, constantly emasculating me and my grandfather. She would also micromanage Ed's day, never letting him go off for an hour alone without calling out, asking where he was. She also did not like letting him into the town, so for the most part, Ed was confined to the ranch, which he felt was like a prison. To what extent Maud Kemper was actually verbally abusive to Ed, like Clarnell, and to what extent a disturbed teenager was just projecting those traits onto another female authority figure, we'll never know for certain. I imagine there's a good amount of projection there. It's very unusual. It's going to be real. It's not Clarnell's mother, it's his father's mother. So just the chances of being so crazily abusive, I don't think so. I mean, even if it's a little bit of abusive, it's not just a smidgen of abuse. It's not going to be the same. Ed later claimed he fantasized about murdering his grandmother at this time. Ed's grandfather, when he was of lucid mind, tried bonding with his grandson. He gave Ed a .22 caliber rifle and said it'd pay him a little bit of pocket money for every rabbit and gopher that the boy shot. The only rule was that Ed could not shoot at the birds. Naturally, Ed ignored this rule and, quote, "I was blowing them away so fast, the birds started flying in a square just to avoid the place." Ed enrolled at the local school, got good grades, and never had any disciplinary issues. He also got a pet dog, which kept him company on the ranch, and which he fortunately did not butcher. He befriended a lad on a neighboring farm named Mike Dozier, but the friendship came to an abrupt end when Dozier's family cat disappeared along with a pillowcase from the house. Oh my god. It's like the cat's missing, there's a pillowcase missing, and there's the psycho boy next door. Well, don't hang out with the psycho boy next door, Mikey. Meanwhile, back in Montana, Clarnell married her third husband in May 1964, Harold Strandberg, a 43-year-old plumber. How is Clarnell marrying? How has she been married 3 times? She sounds awful. The first 2 years of the marriage seem to have gone fairly well, but once Clarnell's abuse set in, Harold stopped having sex with her for the remaining 3 years of the marriage. According to Ed, she had verbal capabilities like you wouldn't believe. I used to watch her field strip grown men in emotional little contests, and when they got to the point they wanted to smack her, then she started attacking them on beating women. Oh, slap the woman around. She'd toy with them on that. And I'd watch these guys dance around the room having fits, knocking out windows, punching holes in the door, and stomping off. Harold Strandberg had an affair with another woman, and he formally divorced Clarnell and married his lover in 1969, and no one can blame him. Meanwhile, at the end of June 1964, Ed went back to Montana to visit his mother and sisters. He spent 2 weeks there. When he returned to his grandparents' ranch, Maud Kemper was alarmed at his sullen and creepy behavior. She wasn't before. How much worse could it get? You put the neighbor's cat in a bag and killed it, allegedly. It seems clear that Ed had regressed while spending time with Clarnell. His actions became increasingly ominous. Ed would stare at his grandmother constantly and would not look away until she told him to stop. According to Ed, he fantasized about locking her in the outhouse and shooting it full of holes. More than once, he aimed his .22 caliber rifle at his grandmother when she wasn't looking. Maud later confiscated the rifle because Ed kept shooting birds, and she made Ed promise not to touch his grandfather's .45 caliber automatic pistol. More than once, she took the .45 with her in her purse when she and her husband went into town. Ed felt insulted and thought about calling in a tip to the police, claiming, quote, "There's a little old lady walking around town with a .45 in her purse. And she's planning a hold-up." Yeah, it's going to go nowhere, though. They're going to be like, "Were you planning a hold-up?" No, I just have a gun. This is America. We're allowed guns. It's just nonsense. On the 27th of August 1964, Ed was at the kitchen table with Maud, proofreading her latest children's book. Edmund Sr. was out grocery shopping in town. At one point, Maud looked up and saw that Ed was staring at her again. She told him to stop it. Ed abruptly got up from the table, took his .22 caliber rifle from the hook on the wall, whistled for his pet dog, and then told his grandmother he was going hunting. He walked out the door while she protested, saying, "You better not shoot any birds." Kemper stood on the porch for a minute and then quietly re-entered the house. He walked up behind his grandmother, raised the rifle, and shot the woman in the back of the head. According to Kemper, blood immediately spurted from her nose and mouth. Maud collapsed on the kitchen table. For good measure, Kemper shot her twice more in the back. The dog, frightened, ran off and hid in the bushes outside. This is his first kill, right? His first murder. No murders so far. Just lots of murders of little animals and bugs. Dude. To quote, "That was an outburst. I felt I had to. My grandmother had agreed with me from the gate that she wouldn't get into little humiliating mind games with me like my mother had done. And I agreed I wouldn't do certain things. And then this mind game stuff started up. Again, I can find no evidence that Maud Kemper subjected Ed to any severe form of abuse of the kind we can thoroughly verify from eyewitnesses that Ed suffered from at the hands of Clarnell. It's more likely that Ed came back from his visit in Montana thoroughly unhinged and later used claims of abuse to justify Maud's murder. Or perhaps it was true. Either way, to this day, it's a story that Ed himself seems to resolutely believe. Kemper got a towel and wrapped it around his grandmother's head to staunch the bleeding. He then dragged her body into the bedroom. Minutes later, Kemper heard his grandfather's car drive up the hill and pull into the driveway. Edmund Sr. began unloading groceries. Again, Kemper raised his .22 caliber rifle and shot his grandfather straight through the back of the head. Kemper then grabbed his grandfather under his arms, dragged him into the nearby garage, and lowered the door. Kemper then went back outside, turned on the garden hose, and washed his grandfather's blood from the driveway. Kemper's justification for killing his grandfather was that he feared Edmund Sr. would have a heart attack when he saw his wife's body. Yeah, great justification there. So he's like, well, he might die, so I just thought, it's better that he absolutely is sure of dying. He feared his grandfather might become so angry that he'd grab his .45 and seek revenge. Well, if he had, that would have saved a lot of people a lot of anguish. Kemper also stated that he did not want his increasingly senile old grandfather to live without his wife. Well, in that case, Ed, how about you don't kill her in the first place, dick? In that sense, Kemper argued it was a mercy killing. Kemper also said that after killing both of his grandparents, he briefly contemplated suicide, but thought he could not, quote, leave this mess for others to clean up. Oh, Ed, if only you had.
You're getting carried away. You think too much. Just do it.
Imagine the less suffering that happened in the world. If only you'd been like, no, should have killed myself. You should have killed yourself. You should have. Jesus Christ. Not encouraging suicide or anything like that. But, well, this is the story of Ed Kemper. Let's just say that he goes on to cause just a little bit of misery in the world. All right? Because of the remote location of his grandparents' farm, it would have been many days before anyone investigated and discovered the double murder. Kemper could have done a runner and been gone long before any of that happened. Instead, Kemper telephoned his mother in Montana. He told Clarnell that both his grandmother and his grandfather were dead. Kemper initially lied and said that it was an accident from a hair trigger malfunction on his rifle. Clarnell saw through this immediately and demanded he tell the truth. Kemper told the whole story, whereupon Clarnell ordered him to turn himself into the police. Kemper called the local sheriff's office and 2 officers came up to the ranch and arrested him. Under questioning, Kemper admitted to the killings and said, quote, I just wondered how it would feel to shoot grandma. And wow. Okay. No prison for the rest of his life? Come on. What goes on? How is this man free to go on to become the co-ed killer? Good Lord. The dangers of a bleeding heart. In late summer 1964, Madera County newspaper ran the headline, North Fork Bay, 15, mad at world, kills grandparents. Kemper sat in juvenile. Oh, he's 15. Okay, so that's how he can get back out, because he's a kid. So he's only going to be in prison for a shorter while, and then he's going to get released as an adult, and then guess what? He's not going to be any different as an adult, because he's Ed Kemper, isn't he? While the California Youth Authority decided what to do with him, he was analyzed by a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, and as such, Kemper was judged legally insane. On 6th of December 1964, just prior to his 16th birthday, he was sent to Atascadero State Hospital for psychiatric treatment. Kemper would later quote, saying, "I was born there." It is significant that the court psychiatrist concluded the following about Ed's case. Quote, "He was psychotic at the time of the murders, confused and unable to function. He has paranoid ideation, growing more and more bizarre. It is noteworthy that he is more paranoid towards women, all except his mother, who is the real culprit." In the first 3 weeks of Ed Kemper's clinical observation at Atascadero State Hospital, doctors throughout the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia are reporting, quote, "He shows no flight of ideas, no interference with thought, no expression of delusions or hallucinations, and no evidence of bizarre thinking." Instead, doctors concluded that Kemper was suffering trauma from severe and prolonged abuse at the hands of his mother, impairing his judgment at the time of the murders. They also classified him as, quote, "having a personality trait disturbance, passive-aggressive type." Atascadero State Hospital housed approximately 1,000 patients. Whoa. The majority of them adult male, most of them murderers, some of them serial rapists, some of them pedophiles. At the time in 1960s California, Atascadero prided itself as a progressive institution which put a lot of effort into the treatment and rehabilitation of its inmates back into society. I don't think Ed Kemper should go back into society, to be honest. And probably the same for a lot of these inmates. And I don't want to say like prison isn't about reform. I think prison should be about reform. But double murder, is that what reform should be aimed at? Pedophiles, rapists, are these people changing? I don't probably think so. This reputation arguably put pressure on the staff to judge a disproportionate number of patients as rehabilitated after only a few years there. Yeah, that is not a good thing, and I'm imagining that's why Ed Kemper gets out of this place pretty sharpish, despite a double murder. Double murder of his grandparents. Of the inmates originally sent to Atascadero, roughly 50% of them were judged beyond help and sent to prison. Okay, another 10% of them would never leave Atascadero in their lifetimes. A whopping 40% of inmates were considered rehabilitated and returned to society. According to their own statistics, approximately 10% of the inmates released back into society would reoffend, although other mental health authorities have argued that percentage was higher and ignored due to a lack of follow-up research. Yeah, there's not a lot of motivation for them to do that follow-up research because they're like, oh, it could be bad. It could be bad, and we need to keep our statistics good. It's like, I don't know if this is how it actually works, but remember that episode of that TV show House, where he couldn't get a surgeon to perform an operation because he was like, I don't think it'll succeed. And House is like, yeah, but the patient's going to die if you don't do this. So they're going to die anyway. And he's like, yeah, but it affects my stats. Like, I want to be known for doing this surgery really well. And if the patient dies, then it's going to affect my stats. And I'm like, that is insane. So House ends up like blackmailing him to do the surgery. Classic House. That show was great. Until it wasn't. Ed Kemper, polite and compliant with all requests, was subjected to the full gamut of psychological and personality tests. He soon learned how to tailor his answers to tell doctors what they wanted to hear. He was also given an IQ test for the first time in his life and was found to be highly intelligent and high functioning. As such, some of the doctors took Kemper under their wing, viewing him as a pet project. In their view, Kemper, only 16, could not only be fully rehabilitated into society, but could probably become a highly distinguished and productive member of that society. They even fancied the idea that Ed Kemper could become a mental health expert himself, a fantasy that Ed Kemper did nothing to discourage. Yeah, Ed Kemper is a smart... What's that dark triad? The Machiavellianness? Exercising it here to the max. Like, just pushing those buttons to get out of hospital. Like, of course. What else would you be doing? All you'll be thinking about is what buttons am I pressing, what answers am I giving to get out of this hospital? And getting away with a double murder. So I can go on and do more murders and eventually cut my mum's head off. Holy and put my in it. What the Things escalated to the point that they gave Ed Kemper a job shadowing the doctors of the institution. To quote Dr. Frank Vanasek, director of research, he worked in the psychology laboratory testing patients, serving as a crew leader in giving the MMPI and other tests. He administered a test that included a hostility scale and helped to score it. He was a very good worker, and that is not typical of a sociopath. So, let us be clear about this. While incarcerated for the brutal murder of his grandparents, Ed Kemper was conscripted to assess the mental stability of the other inmates. This was hugely irresponsible. In reality, Kemper was using all of his hard work as a tool of manipulation in order for doctors to consider him cured and let him out of hospital, obviously. And doctors, you gotta be smart. And I guess the thing is, people who are really good at manipulation are good at manipulating all people. But it's like, these are people who should be looking out for that manipulation. They literally probably gave him the narcissistic test. They gave him that Machiavellian test. They know he's manipulative unless he manipulated the results. And if the tests allow for that, then they need to be reformatted somehow. Because, come on. Quote, I broke my butt. I was the dynamic young man. And they began to say, maybe we can let him out sooner than we thought. Kemper's education not only consisted of learning to fool psychologists and to parrot their jargon, he also spent a long time listening to other criminals about their exploits. Primarily, Kemper was frequently listening to rapists talk about what they did to their female victims. He heard this stuff at the age of 16. He was a virgin, completely isolated from girls his age, and his hormones and sexual curiosity were at their peak. And Kemper already had fairly twisted views about violence towards women. Most crucially, Kemper learned from the mistakes of these predators. In order to get away with a violent sexual act, one must not leave witnesses. It's a lesson that Kemper says that he took to heart. And we know he took it to heart because this is Ed Kemper we're talking about. We're all vaguely familiar with what he's about to get up to. In order to hasten his release, Kemper also lied that he'd embraced Jesus as his Lord and Savior, and he began memorizing relevant verses about redemption from the Bible. He also became active in the JCs, a civic leadership organization targeted toward American youth that courted the likes of Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, Bill Gates, and serial killer John Wayne Gacy among its membership. I was wondering why I'm familiar with that name, and it's because it was in the John Wayne Gacy episode. Combined with his already docile nature and the fact that he was keeping company with rather stuffy doctors of a previous generation, Kemper transformed into what he called, quote, an old fogey, despite the fact that he was still a teenager. Meanwhile, in the latter half of the 1960s, young Californians his age were casting off the image of clean-cut proto-adults, growing out their hair, doing hard drugs, having promiscuous sex, listening to outrageous music, and subscribing to all manner of bizarre, mystical, and politically radical beliefs. Ed Kemper missed all of that. He was a dyed-in-the-wool square who emerged from hospital not knowing how to relate to his peers, much less chat up women. After 5 years at the hospital, Ed Kemper was released on parole, overseen by the California Youth Authority. 5 years in hospital for a double murder of his grandparents. The power of manipulation there, Jesus. It was December the 18th, 1969, his 21st birthday. His final psychological report concluded, quote, if I were to see this patient without having any history available, I would think we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free from any psychotic illness. I see no reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or any member of society. Since it may allow him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records. Permanently remove from his records a double murder. And indeed, the fact that Kemper had murdered his grandparents was eventually expunged from his record in 1972. As far as the wider world was concerned, Ed Kemper was a fine, upstanding citizen with no criminal history and nothing mentally wrong with him. He pulled the wool over their eyes so hard that he just gave them what they wanted, that they could cure someone like this. Oh my God. I'd like to think that if I was one of these doctors, I wouldn't be falling for that shit, but apparently I would be. On the question of his rehabilitation, Kemper later said, quote, where might I be if my parole had been successful? I believe I'd be married and have children and be heading toward my first grandchildren. The staff at the hospital recommended to the California Youth Authority that Kemper be sent to a halfway house, receive assistance in finding a job, and be encouraged to enroll in college. He could then transition to society in a controlled environment. They also said Kemper should be encouraged to join social gatherings so that he could get to know people of his age and have a chance to interact with young women. Above all, Kemper's psychiatrist said that he should not, under any circumstances, be released to the custody of his abusive mother, Clarnell Strandberg, since it would place Kemper at high risk of regressing to his previous mental state. state and reoffending. Now that is some excellent advice. After 3 months with a staggering level of competence typical of modern government, releasing Ed Kemper to the custody of his mother was exactly what the California Youth Authority did. California Youth Authority, what the f*** you up to? The doctors who, listen to them. Don't do this. It's crazy. He went there for 2 weeks and then he came back and murdered his grandparents. What do you think's going to happen when you send him back there? Could he have actually possibly been reformed? I've always through this whole thing, I've been no, he's manipulating the doctors, blah, blah, blah. But maybe he could have been reformed. Maybe if he had been put back in that dark place with his mother, maybe he'd have just kept it all buried and just been a regular member of society. Holy California Youth Authority, you have a burden to bear, guys. Jesus. The urge to kill. Clarnell Strandberg, fresh from a bitter divorce with her abused and unfaithful husband Harold, had moved to 609A Ord Street in Aptos in the San Francisco Bay Area. Ed's older sister Susan had moved out, but his younger sister Alan, now aged 18, was still living at home. Clarnell got a job as a secretary at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Note to Simon, in the UC system, this is just how they call various universities in different cities. Oh, okay. Okay, so it's all one University of California. And then they have all these, I've heard of these. University of California, Berkeley, I want to say. Is that where Berkeley is? Okay. Within a few months, Clarnell was judged to be extremely good at her job and was promoted to administrative assistant to one of the various college provosts. She adored campus life, made numerous friends, and dove deep into the second wave feminist movement, adopting a maternal and caring attitude toward female students at the university. Clarnell even managed to briefly get her alcoholism under control. When Ed Kemper moved back in with his mother at the beginning of 1970, Clarnell started drinking heavily again. And it was not long before the two were fighting, raising alarm with some of the neighbors. It was Ed who made apologies to them for all the late-night shouting. As Ed later said, quote, "My mother and I started right in on our horrendous battles. Just horrible battles, violent and vicious. I've never been in such a vicious verbal battle with anyone. It would have gone to fists with a man, but this was my mother. She insisted on arguing, just over stupid things. I remember one roof raiser was over whether I should have my teeth cleaned." Boy, this woman she's a horrible woman. Having been locked up for 5 years, Ed had trouble adapting to the outside world. He was a 1950s throwback square living in Santa Cruz, California in the year 1970. He might have fit in better in Utah or Wyoming, but he was in the one part of the country where most young people were desperate to be as trendy and progressive as possible. Not to mention, Ed was already inept socially from his congenital psychopathy and years of maternal abuse. To quote, "There was a constant battle in me that was a major thing my whole life. I didn't have any social attitude, any social personality at all." What shocked Kemper most profoundly was the transformation of young women. The clothes had gotten tighter, their skirts shorter, their cleavage sometimes absolutely scandalous by earlier standards, and they seemed to come and go wherever they pleased. A staggering number of them could be seen standing by the side of the road hitchhiking. According to Ed, the sight of these women contributed to my frustration, my inability to communicate, socially, sexually. I wasn't impotent, but emotionally, I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships. I knew absolutely nothing about the whole area, even just sitting down and talking to a young lady. Well, that's just something that practice will get you. You just got to go and do it. Just go. And it'll be super uncomfortable because you don't know what you're doing. But eventually, you'll get there and it'll be fine. Practice makes perfect.
Yes, master.
The culture shock was also profound. Ed grew to hate hippies, the mods, the rockers, the neo-Marxists, and all the rest of what he saw as ephemeral, pretentious, boomer bullshit. With this one, I get it, culture changes and movements and all of this stuff, but it is pretentious, isn't it? It's always so pretentious. It's yeah, you guys are going in the right direction, but do we have to be such douchebags about it? Ed Kemper liked cops who represented a form of rigid societal order he had gotten used to in Atascadero, especially since they were the ones beating on the hippies. Okay, not that far though, Ed. He was also a big fan of Richard Nixon, the Republican president who claimed to be at war with the last vestiges of degenerate 1960s culture. Kemper applied for the Santa Cruz police force and later the highway patrol, only to be told that at 6'9" he was above the regulation height limit for officers. Also, he was told the fact was, prior to 1972, his juvenile record had not yet been expunged, and some have speculated that the police force did not make an exception to the height regulation on account of his unstable past. Yeah, bro, you can't be a police officer if your record has not been expunged, so it's still there. And I also feel like for jobs like police officer, anything where you could be around guns or potential violence, that kind of stuff, there should be a special thing where it's like, well, it's expunged for everyone else except for the police and those institutions, where they could be like, whoa, bro, you double murdered somebody, but how about you don't be a cop? That sounds like a bad idea for you to be a cop because you double murdered someone, even though it's been expunged with the police, we know. It should be special. Otherwise, it seems slightly absurd for the police force to shrug off a guy for being too big. Nevertheless, Kemper may, well, sort of, but I mean, they must have like boot sizes and uniforms and all of this stuff that it's like, if the dude's too big, he's too big. They'd have to make him special uniforms and stuff, and I don't think government works like that. They're just like, well, you fit or you don't fit. We're not putting round pegs into square holes, it's the government. Nevertheless, Kemper made a habit of hanging out at a cop bar called the Jury Room, where he unsurprisingly gained the nickname Big Ed. He spent hours sipping beer with cops, swapping notes on different kinds of guns, and discussing with them various criminal cases. The Jury Room would later prove a useful place for Ed to gather intelligence on the police manhunt once the co-ed killer's reign of terror began. Despite Kemper's childhood traumas, his awkward social graces, and seriously messed up feelings towards women, Big Ed did wind up meeting and having mild success with the opposite sex. After all, at 21, he wasn't bad looking. He was tall, powerfully built, with a deep, resonant voice that he'd later use in prison to narrate over 5,000 hours of books on tapes for the visually impaired. Holy shit! And I'm thinking, that is a lot. That is a lot of audio. Ed did his best socializing with the ladies who came into the cop bar. Meanwhile, his mother, Clarnell, introduced him to a few women whom she knew from the university in the hopes of fixing him up and getting him out of the house. However, Ed took these introductions as personal insults since, according to Ed, Clarnell would unfailingly choose girls who were socially awkward and physically unappealing. Ed thought this reflected Clarnell's low opinion of him. Holy this woman is a piece of work. Instead, Big Ed's interests tended toward rather good-looking, well-dressed young women who hadn't fallen in with the hippie movement, but he was crippled by extreme anxiety when talking to them, and also by an immense sexual dysfunction. Kemper claims he almost had sex with a woman in a one-night stand, but obviously something had gone wrong because the lady blew Kemper off when he approached her a second time. Ed also claims that he had gotten physically intimate with a handful of other women, but he'd never been able to achieve climax due to the vanilla nature of the sexual encounters. So despite everything he'd later claim in prison, Ed remained a virgin. While staying with his mother, Kemper was initially compelled by his parole requirements to attend the local community college, but Kemper did not enjoy academia, despite having an aptitude for it. Instead, Kemper opted to what his mother called menial jobs, first labourer at the Green Giant Farms near Watsonville, and later with the California Division of Highways. What, didn't she say that her husband was a menial job as an electrician, even though he went on to go work with nuclear bombs and stuff? Oh, I know this is a video where it's like we should all hate Ed Kemper because he's a violent, horrible murderer. But at this point, I hate his mum even more. Eventually, Kemper saved up enough money to move out of his mother's place to an apartment he shared with a male friend in the town of Alameda. Yet, even here, Kemper was not free of his mother. She constantly telephoned to check up on Ed and frequently demanded to come over. Sometimes, Clarnell paid her son surprise visits. According to Ed, the hassle with my mother made me very inadequate around women because they posed a threat to me. Inside, I blew them up very large. You know, the little games women play. I couldn't play them, meet their demands, so I backslid. Kemper wasn't earning much money as a simple labourer and was frequently unable to pay his half of the rent for the Alameda apartment. His roommate, however, was extremely understanding. This is a throwback to the beginning of today's episode, and was able to cover the rent on his own. In fact, Ed's friend just enjoyed having the extra spending money when Kemper could pay, along with having the extra company at home. Nevertheless, Ed frequently felt compelled to avoid leeching off his friends by moving back in with his mother on 609A Ord Street. Oh my god. This is like the definition of a toxic environment, which makes him dangerous. The fear of leeching, however, was just a convenient excuse. Ed felt drawn back to his mother time and time again. He endeavored, during his stays with Clarnell, to stabilize his relationship with her. Quote, "With my Atascadero learning, I kept trying to push her toward where she'd be a nice motherly type and quit being such a damn manipulating, controlling, vicious beast. She was Mrs. Wonderful up on the campus, had everything under control. When she comes home, she lets everything down, and she's just a pure She'd bust her butt being super nice at work, and come home at night and be a Ed Kemper also claims he made peace with his father for the murder of his grandparents. Yeah, these were his dad's parents. Dude. According to Ed, they met in an LA restaurant and talked and laughed for hours. This claim is disputed by Kemper's stepbrother, who said Ed's father tortured himself for the rest of his life for dumping an unstable teen on Maud and Edmund Sr. Yeah, of the two outcomes here, we've got Ed Kemper's story. It's like, no, I murdered his parents, my grandparents, and then we met up for lunch and laughed for hours and had a grand old time. Is that one more likely, or is his stepbrother's account of, no, our dad tortured himself because he left his unstable son with his parents, and then his unstable son, who he raised, murdered his parents, and he tortured himself about that? Which one sounds more likely, everybody? The only reason he did so was because he felt that the boy was too creepy and unsettling to live with his new wife and son, and Maud and Edmund Sr. paid the price. With his meager funds from his day job, Kemper was initially able to buy a motorcycle, which he crashed twice. First, Kemper injured his head and had to take several days off work. The California Division of Highways put him on paid leave. Later, Kemper was hit by a driver and broke his arm, requiring it to be bolted back together with a steel plate. Given it is Ed Kemper we're talking about here, it may or may not be significant that the driver was female. He sued her and received $15,000 in an out-of-court settlement, or roughly $111,000 in today's money. Good Lord. With part of that money, Kemper bought a 1969 hardtop Ford Galaxy sedan. That's a lot of money. Now that Ed had a car, he started picking up female hitchhikers. And driving them wherever he wanted to go. He did so, in part, so they could gain more experience interacting with women. Talking to them still gave him extreme anxiety and made him feel a bit queasy. Giving rides to women became one of Kemper's regular activities. By Kemper's own reckoning, between 1971 and 1972, he gave rides to 150 female hitchhikers. That's roughly one every 2 or 3 days. Kemper also had a tendency to only pull over for them if they were young and good-looking. Oddly enough, Kemper did not mention his new hobby to the cops at the jury room. Probably smart, because those cops are going to be like, bro, the people who pick up hitchhikers. Well, that's not true. I think people who, like 99.9% of hitchhikers who pick up people and drop them off wherever they're going are good people. But the ones who are doing it almost professionally, not professionally, but like driving around just to pick up hitchhikers, and they're driving around and just picking up hitchhikers who are young, good-looking women. Let's just say if I was a cop, I'd be like, let's just keep a little bit of an eye on him, shall we? I mean, just to be safe, it's probably fine, but just in case, keep an eye on old Edo here. The settlement money also allowed Ed to move out of his mother's house once again and bunk with his friends in Alameda. With the remaining balance of the money, Kemper started stockpiling weapons. So he bought a collection of knives, including one he called the General, that he sharpened almost every day. Kemper also took a keen interest in guns. At first, Kemper just borrowed a gun from his supervisor at the California Division of Highways. That way, he was able to avoid any awkward questions about history of mental illness and prior convictions in the gun store. Wait, you can loan people guns without paperwork? Isn't that a massive loophole? It's like, yeah, hi, I'm in the gun store. Yeah, I'm buying a gun. And they're like, okay, well, there's like the cooling off period. We need like 7 forms of ID. We need a criminal background check, blah, blah, blah. And they'll be like, how much is the gun? It's like $400. And they're like, or I could loan you this gun for a period of 10 years. And let's just say I might forget about it. Oh, how much is the loan for 10 years? Oh, it's $400. And what about, we don't need paperwork. It's just a loan. It's just surely not. Surely not. His juvenile record was not expunged until 1972. Right. But soon, Kemper was dropping hundreds of dollars on a large collection of firearms, from small handguns to powerful rifles, which he stored in his car and in his closet. When it came to the forms Kemper had to fill out, he simply ticked no when it came to the box for prior conviction for murder. Oh my God. That's like, just like, no, nothing. Done. No worries. That's all. It's just on an honesty system. He's smoking crack. What the f***?
Sorry. What did you say?
After his record was expunged, there was no way of doing a background check and finding out otherwise. Soon Kemper began bringing his knives and guns with him when he offered rides to women. He'd conceal them under the driver's seat. To this mobile little arsenal, Kemper added garbage bags, blankets, and handcuffs. Quote, "I'm picking up young women, and I'm going a little bit further each time. It's a daring kind of thing. At first there wasn't a gun. I'm driving along. We'd go to a vulnerable place where there aren't people watching, where I could act out, and I'd say, no, I can't. And then a gun is in the car, hidden, and this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. This fantastic passion." Over the course of this little campaign, Kemper became better at appearing non-threatening and getting girls in the car. If a girl simply asked if Kemper was going her way, he'd say yes, regardless of where the location was. Yeah, that's that more creepy thing. It's like, where are you going? Yeah, no, I'm going there. If I'm if I'm a hitchhiker and I get in a car and I'm asking to go to some obscure place and the person's like, yeah, no, I'm all that was exactly where I'm going, I'll be like, okay, I'm just gonna wait for the next person, thank you. I mean, not me, but if I was like a young, attractive woman.
There's some strange people in this world.
I've hitchhiked a couple of times in my life. One time was fine. The other time was a bit weird because the people were really racist. It was in Georgia. I was in Georgia in the south of America, and it was like a 10-minute drive. And somehow in this conversation, the people were just really racist about black people. And I'm like, oh my God, what is happening? It was really, truly bizarre. Like I'd never seen such like just plain overt racism. It was very strange. If a girl didn't like the look of Ed, she might cleverly ask Kemper where he was going first, then lie that she was headed in the opposite direction so that she could wait for a different car. That is the smart way to hitchhike. Where are you going? That is the right way to do it. Pro tip there. Never thought about that. But then Ed would simply shrug and say, "Hop in, I'll drive you there," and circle back. Be like that. Then it's like, no, thank you. No, thank you very much. Other times, Ed would pull alongside a girl and act like he was in a hurry, so the girl would assume he didn't have the time to try anything sinister on the ride. Once the girl was in the car, Ed would carefully probe her about the destination and the area to try and determine whether she had traveled that route before. If she hadn't, it would be easier for Ed to drive in another direction and take her to a secluded area. Once in a secluded area, Ed might pull over, say he briefly needed to check the tires or the engine, and then see if the girl got nervous before they drove off again. To top it all off, Ed convinced Clarnell to give him a staff parking sticker for the University of California, Santa Cruz. It was distinguishable by a large letter A. Not only was it good for parking closer to the buildings at Santa Cruz, the same parking pass was also valid for every single campus for the University of California system from UCLA to UC Berkeley. There we go. I knew it. Big brain. And having a parking sticker usually reserved for university staff on Ed's car made girls more comfortable with the idea of hopping inside with him. For roughly 150 rides, Ed never threatened the girls, never sexually assaulted them, and never did anything illegal. They'd simply arrive, unharmed, at their destination. But that wasn't going to last forever. Kemper began to feel sexual and homicidal urges when he was with the women. He called these sensations his, quote, little zapples. Kemper also began to fantasize vividly again, like he had done at his grandparents' farm. To quote, "I had fantasies about mass murder. Whole groups of select women I could get together in one place, get them dead, and then make mad, passionate love to their corpses, taking life away from them, a living human being, and then having possession of everything that used to be theirs. All that would be mine. Everything." Oh my God. Is there a sentence so far in today's episode that speaks more to the insane mind of Ed Kemper? That is just... You know when someone says something logically that absolutely makes, like, they think they're being logical, but it absolutely makes no logical sense whatsoever to anyone who's not insane? That is the definition of that. Thus spake Kemper. To quote again, "On May the 7th, 1972, at approximately 4 p.m., I picked up two girls on Ashby Avenue in Berkeley. They were carrying a sign which said they wanted to go to Stanford. I asked them a few questions and determined to my satisfaction that they were not familiar with the area. Without pressing too hard and doing a few loopy-loops around freeways and bypasses, I managed to think of some way of following through with the act of killing them with the least amount of jeopardy on me. What I did was, I stopped for gas in Alameda, where I was living. Then I took them in the opposite direction from Stanford along the 680, which would come out on a rural highway. I told them a story about how I was working for the California Division of Highways. They were were impressed with the radio antenna on my car and thought I was a secret agent or something. I kept telling them that I wasn't a policeman, and they'd give each other little knowing looks. I didn't really make much of an effort to deceive them because they were terribly naive. Anything I said went over just fine. Kemper drove toward the small town of Livermore, looking for a country lane that might end in a secluded cul-de-sac. He found one and stopped. Kemper then withdrew a 9mm handgun from under the car seat. He had passed the point of no return. To quote again, I was scared. I kept telling myself I didn't really want to do it, but I was determined. I was frustrated because it was like a game to me. Up to that point, it always had been. It was a big adventure, a big thrill. But I never permitted myself to follow through and take a chance on getting in serious trouble to commit rape. I decided from my past stay at Atakastero and listening to a lot of stories that it was better to not have someone unless you were absolutely sure that they weren't going to tell anybody. And in this case, now that I think back on it, I honestly think I could have gotten away with doing exactly what I told the girls I was going to do, which was rape them. I didn't say that word, but one of them asked me, "What do you want?" And I just lifted the gun between the two of them and I said, "You know what I want." The one girl, Marianne, assumed command over the two of them and over the conversation. I turned to her and ascertained that she was not the talkative one, but the one who was more in a leadership position. The other girl was Anita, who was overwhelmed by my presentation of the weapon, despite there not being any verbal threats. The quote ends there. Fresno State University, Marianne Pesh, aged 18, tried calmly to convince Kemper to let them go. He hadn't done anything yet, and they promised to tell no one. Anita Lachesa, a student at the same university, also aged 18, remained perfectly quiet, frozen in fear. Kemper told the girls that one of them had to get into the trunk, so he'd only have to keep an eye on one girl as he drove back to his apartment in Alameda, where he said he planned to sexually assault them and let them go. The whole story was a lie. To quote again, "At this time, of course, I had the full intention of killing them both right then and there. I would have loved to have raped them, but I did not have any experience in that area. I had very limited exposure to the opposite sex, and from 15 to 21, I had been locked up with just men. Anyway, I decided that Anita was more gullible and would be easier to control, so I told her she was going in the trunk. I took some handcuffs and I reached for one of Marianne's arms as I pulled it back. I picked up the gun like I was going to hit her with it and told her not to do that again. I said, "You know, I'm running the show here," or some such cliche, so she allowed me to cuff one of her arms and put the other one around the seatbelt behind the lock, and I left her there. I took the other girl to the trunk, and just before she got in, she reiterated something Marianne said. "Please don't do this," or something like that. I said, "What? Are you going to start in on me now too?" Kemper locked Anita Lachesa in the trunk and returned to the back seat where Marianne was struggling to break herself free. Quote, "I almost stuck the gun up her nose to impress on her that it was real. Then my lips started quivering and I started losing control. I told her if she kept this up, then they both were going to be in a lot of trouble. At this point, she cooperated. I cuffed her behind her back. I think I accidentally brushed the back of my hand against one of her breasts while I was handcuffing her and embarrassed me. I even said something like, 'Whoops, I'm sorry,' or something like that. I tried to get a plastic bag over her head. I had this nifty idea about suffocating her. She was complaining that she couldn't breathe. I said I'd tear a hole in the bag, not intending to, really. I had a long rope. I started pulling it down over what I thought was her neck. I pulled it tight, and that's where I almost blew it. While Kemper strangled Marianne as she lay face down on the back seat, the rope snapped in two. Meanwhile, Marianne bit a hole in the plastic bag, allowing her to breathe. Enraged, Kemper pulled out a switchblade. Quoting again, "I poised the blade over her back, trying to decide where her heart was, and I struck her in the middle of her back. It stuck a little bit. She said something like, 'ow' or 'oh,' and I pulled it back out. And I did it again, hit the same damn tough spot. I was getting mad and told her to shut up. She said she couldn't and began moaning. I struck at several places on both sides of the back, and I noticed as I went further down she was getting a little louder and more pained in her cries. But none got really loud. That always bothered me. I couldn't figure out why. It was almost like she didn't want to blow up or start screaming or something. She was maintaining control. Then it got too much for her. She turned completely over to see what the hell I was doing. I stabbed her once in the lower intestine. I did not want to stab her heart, which would have made her death less agonizing because I was afraid to go anywhere near her breasts. It was getting pretty messy there in the back seat. She turned over on her stomach and I continued stabbing. I don't know how many times I stabbed her. I'm trying to think. Usually I keep track of something like that, comparing notes, but in this case, I didn't. I did it with Anita because that really amazed me. With Marianne, I was really quite struck by her personality and her looks, and there was almost a reverence there. I didn't touch her too much after that. That is, other than to get rid of physical evidence such as clothing and later the body. Anyway, she was crying out a little louder, and I kept trying to shut her up, covering her mouth, and she kept pulling away. One time she didn't, and I still heard her cry. I could have sworn it came out of her back. There were several holes in the lung area and bubbles and things coming out. At this point, she turned her head and called out her friend's name. It was slow, and it was not loud. That was the last thing she said. Yeah, I assume we have all these records from like all of those like confessions and tapes and writings that he's made over the years. It is super disturbing. I felt like I was getting nowhere, the quote continues. Not that I was getting any kicks out of stabbing her. I reached around and grabbed her by the chin and pulled her head back and slashed her throat. I made a definite effort at it, and it was extremely deep on both sides. She lost consciousness immediately. Kemper got up, exited the car, and headed to the trunk. He opened it, and Anita asked him with alarm what had happened to Marianne. Kemper showed Anita the blood on his hands and told her that Marianne had gotten smart with me, and that he had been forced to hit her. Kemper told her that it had broken Marianne's nose and that Anita should come help. Anita duly climbed out of the trunk. The reason why Kemper lied was, quoting again, "I didn't want her to know what had happened. She's about to die. Why does she need to know that?" I couldn't deal with telling her that. And when I attacked her, she at first didn't realize what was happening. The knife didn't go through. She had very heavy coveralls on. The blow knocked her right up onto the lid of the car. I just kept on mindlessly attacking. She fell back into the trunk. I slammed down the lid of the trunk. She isn't dead. She's dying. And I panicked, and I thought I just locked the car keys in there because I didn't find them in my pocket. So I'm kicking on the trunk and yanking on it. Oh no, I don't believe this. I started to run, and I tripped over the gun that I had in my pants that I'd totally forgotten was there. And I stopped and said, "Stop and think." I collected my wits. I picked up my gun and stuck it back in my pants. I checked all my pockets, and there's the keys in my back pocket. I never put them in my back pockets. I thought I was pretty slick, and I went and tripped all over myself. Those first two murders. After calming down, Kemper moved Marianne's body to join Anita's in the trunk. He walked around the car, looking for anything that had fallen on the ground. He found Marianne's wallet, which she may have tossed deliberately to leave a trail of her movements. In Kemper's struggle with Anita, he had accidentally cut his hand, but was so worked up that he did not realize it until an hour later. The wounds ultimately required stitches. Due to Kemper's agitation and inexperience, the whole affair had been rather sloppy. Quoting again, "The first 24 hours, there were 3 clear times where I should have been busted, and I wasn't. Because 3 different individuals or groups of people got scared and minded their own business and looked the other way. The first was just down the road, where 2 married couples were looking at a property. They saw Ed's blood-spattered car, trunk lid and windows. Further down the road, he was pulled over by a highway patrolman for having a broken taillight. Miraculously, the officer did not take note of anything, and he let Ed go. Upon returning to Alameda, Kemper carried the bodies of the 2 women concealed under blankets from the garage to his apartment. During the process, he dropped the blood-stained knife in front of a neighbor who seemed frightened, but did not report anything to the police. Yeah, this is, again, we bring this up often in Casual Criminalist. Like, people don't take action. And if you see something like this, if you hear something suspicious, what did we talk about before? Like, if you hear screams coming from next door, just in case, call the police. Maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe they're watching a movie too loud. But if you've got any doubt in your mind, just in case. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? No one will know it was you. Just give a little ring. Why not? See what the police think about it. It's not a big deal. Just in case. Just in case. Once in the apartment with the bodies, his roommate fortunately not at home, Kemper took Polaroid pictures of the corpses, had sex with them, and then dismembered them. He performed necrotic fellatio on the decapitated heads. Quote, "Rather than enjoying having an orgasm with a dead woman or something, my fantasy was more along the lines of a not-so-forceful rape. I would be in command and she would not be that unwilling. I imagine everybody likes to have dreams like that. Mine did get a little more lurid than that." Ed, what are you talking about? I imagine everyone likes to have dreams with that. Ed. Only people who are super f***ed up have dreams and then don't describe them as nightmares because we can't control what happens in our dreams. But people don't have desire dreams about the head of a dead body, Ed. That is f***ed up. No one likes that, Ed. That's just you. Kemper disposed of all the girls' property in the trash. He placed the remains of the young women in plastic bags and put them in his car. He drove out to the mountains of Loma Prieta to dispose of them. While burying some of the evidence, he was spotted by a couple walking their dog. They grew very quiet, whistled for their dog, quickly got in their car, and drove off. The parents of Mary Ann Pesh and Anita Lucchesa put up missing posters, filed missing persons reports, and searched the route between Berkeley and Stanford that they were supposed to be traveling that day. Police initially told them that the girls were just likely to be runaways. In response, Anita's parents hired a private investigator, and he found nothing. I am like... If my kids are like, especially my daughter's like, Dad, can I have a car? I'll be like, yes, you absolutely can. Do you want a gun? Be like, no hitchhiking. Drive. In classic serial killer style, Ed Kemper returned to the dump site a month later in June 1972 to relive the murders and masturbate at the thought of them. Mary Ann's skull was found in August 1973, but the rest of her body was never found. Anita's remains were never discovered. Given all the details that he's revealed since, hasn't he said where they are? Can't they go find them and reinter them and stuff? Hasn't he said? A 15-year-old girl. Aiko Ku was born to a single mother in a low-income household in Berkeley, California. Aiko's mother worked at a library, and Aiko's grandparents fully supported them by sharing their meager pension. By all accounts, Aiko was a lively, cheerful, intelligent girl. From the age of 4, Aiko had been trained in classical dance. Her family scraped together what little money they could to send her to private school to develop her talent. Aiko managed to stay there by continually achieving scholarships. By the time Aiko reached the age of 9, she was helping out her mother by earning $100 per one of her public dance performances. That's roughly $700 in today's money. She did an average of 3 performances a year. It's pretty good money for a kid. Due to the low family income, they never owned a car. Aiko had seldom ever ridden in one. Instead, she depended on public transport. On the evening of September the 14th, 1972, Aiko was heading to dance class at a studio in San Francisco. She waited for the bus on the corner of Shattuck and University Avenue. There, Aiko briefly spoke to a witness, a girl named Anne, for roughly 5 minutes. Then Aiko told Anne that she was tired of waiting for the bus and decided to hitchhike. To quote, "There was absolutely no problem. Apparently, she was not an accomplished hitchhiker. I didn't come across any of the normal problems I had with girls and their curiosity as to where I was going or what I was doing. After blowing her off ramp and making it sound like an accident, I said whoops, and when I told her, I'm afraid you're not going to make that ballet class tonight, she panicked and said, please don't kill me. You know, that sort of thing. And she was shrieking, sort of. I pulled out this great .357 Magnum and said, do you know what this is? Now behave. I don't want to hurt you or anyone else, but if you try to signal a policeman or anyone else, I'll have to kill him and you. You wouldn't want to be responsible for the death of a man who probably has a wife and kids, would you?" Kemper put the gun back onto the driver's seat. He told Aiko that he was going to rape her and then drive her back to Berkeley and let her go. He drove into the mountains and parked in an area masked by trees from the nearby traffic. Kemper got out of the car and retrieved some rope and medical tape from the trunk. It was then that he discovered he'd locked himself out of the car, the .357 Magnum still under the driver's seat. Most astonishingly, the 15-year-old Aiko then, quote, let me back in the car. I'd locked myself out. She opened the door for me. My gun was under the seat. This is the thing. She's, 15 years old, did we say? It's just... I don't know, I just have no words. It's like... It is not good. Despite Aiko's innocence and naive compliance, Kemper still felt drawn to kill her. Quote, what the hell am I doing telling you that? Am I a masochist? Am I looking to be tormented further? I'm trying to show you how awful this got, how commanding these rages got. Kemper told Aiko to put the medical tape across her mouth. She complied. Kemper then lowered his body onto the girl and roughly shoved his thumb and index finger far down her nostrils. As her mouth was already sealed with tape, she began to suffocate. Aiko began to fight for her life. She grabbed his testicles and squeezed them painfully. She kicked at the car window, but eventually she fell unconscious. Kemper lifted one of her eyelids, just like a doctor, to check for eye movements. Aiko then regained consciousness, and to quote, for a moment, she just looked at me, and I guess she became conscious enough to remember what was happening, and went back into extreme panic for another 45 seconds. Again, Kemper suffocated her, but he made sure this time that Aiko had completely stopped breathing before he released the pressure. He took Aiko out of the car, laid her on the ground, and raped her. Quote, I achieved orgasm. I guess it was 15 to 20 seconds. It was very quick. At that time, I noticed her hair falling over her face and nose. She was breathing again. I took the muffler that she had around her neck and just wrapped it very tight, and I tied a knot in it and choked her around the throat for a moment. Then I was convinced she was dead. I picked her up by the shoulders. She wasn't a very heavy girl. I think she told me she weighed 104.5 pounds. Kemper wrapped Aiko in a blanket and placed her in the trunk. He placed the back of his hand against Aiko's skin. She'd gone cold. Kemper drove back home, stopping off at a bar for a couple of beers. Jesus Christ, while Aiko's body was in the trunk of his car. After Kemper was done drinking, he went to the parking lot and opened the trunk to make sure Aiko was dead. He stood there looking at the girl's body for a good long while, and quoting again, "I suppose I was admiring my work and admiring her beauty and admiring my catch, like a fisherman. There's nothing to admire about this, Ed, you Kemper closed the trunk and drove to his mother's house, where he went inside. He spoke to Clarnell for approximately 30 minutes, while, again, Aiko's body was still in his trunk. Exiting his mother's house, he again opened the trunk and admired his handiwork. To quote again, "Knowing already she was dead, feeling her body to see which parts were still warm, partially out of curiosity, I wrapped her body up very firmly in the blanket. The trunk was a very dirty area." Kemper got back on the road and arrived at his Alameda apartment at 11 p.m. He carried Aiko's body inside and placed her on the bed. He stripped her naked and threw out Aiko's possessions in various trash bins. Kemper proceeded to commit an act of necrophilia before dismembering Aiko's body and stuffing the remains into several trash bags. At the same time, at 11 p.m., Aiko's mother began to worry. She called the dance studio, who said that Aiko had never arrived. At 12:30 a.m., she called the police and reported Aiko missing. Over the coming weeks, Aiko's family put up hundreds of posters around Berkeley, contacted the newspapers, contacted the police in 3 states, and contacted the FBI. They interrogated dozens of people at bus stops. They received little to no information and no response from the public until a girl named Anne said she had seen Aiko get into a 2-door sedan with a male driver. But the trail went cold. 2 days after the murder, Kemper went for a psychiatric exam, which he passed with flying colours. While he was in there, Aiko's head was in a bag in the trunk of his car. Yeah, because he's got that Machiavellian in that dark triad. He's able to manipulate people. He's able to manipulate these psychiatric interrogations because he's been doing them for years, and he's intelligent. And yeah, we need to be better at those, apparently. Give him a brain scan. Can't we just scan his brain and realize that he's a psycho, that he doesn't have any emotions, and that he's lying? I know this was back in the day, but they've got machines now. Those big fMRI machines, don't they do that? Those PET scans or whatever they're called. Come on. Let's start scanning people's brains to see how they are. Under Mother's Window. In the autumn of 1972, Ed Kemper, now aged 23, met an 18-year-old university student from Turlock, California. They met on a beach, and they began dating seriously. According to Kemper, she was young and she was beautiful, had the same advantages, the same upbringing, and the same Disneyland values. Kemper proposed to her in March of 1973. At the request of her parents, this woman has never been identified, but numerous witnesses have attested to her existence. She was small, blonde, she dressed well despite having little money, and she had neatly coiffed hair. She was exact opposite of Ed's mother. She was gentle, she was kind. Ed described her as not particularly bright, and that, quote, "a man would be a fool to marry a woman who is smarter than himself." But Kemper's increasing success with women did not seem to diminish the urge to kidnap them, murder them, and defile their corpses. His lack of romantic experience was never the problem. The psychological legacy of his mother's abuse was Kemper's trigger. And at that point, Clarnell was still alive and well. Kemper had run out his settlement money and again decided to move back in with her. The clock on the ticking time bomb was reset. Why, Ed, can't you just kill your mother? Just kill your mother, who has f***ed you up and made you miserable, and also combined with your natural psychopathy, and just kill her, and maybe that will solve your issues. I mean, it probably won't, and you'll carry on killing, but maybe. I think he does kill the mum, right? Yeah, we already discussed that earlier in this very long episode with the head and the vocal. Jesus. Meanwhile, another predator began working in the Santa Cruz area. Herbert Mullen, a drug addict, also afflicted by paranoid schizophrenia, believed that his father telepathically ordered him to murder people as a sacrifice to prevent earthquakes. Now that is a proper crazy person. Like, Ed Kemper's a psychopath. He is in control of what he's up to. This person is arguably not even, the earthquake person's arguably not even guilty of murder. Like, they're not intending to kill people, they're intending to prevent earthquakes. Which, I mean, oh my. On October the 13th, 1972, he murdered a homeless man with a baseball bat. On October the 24th, he abducted and murdered 24-year-old Cabrillo College student Mary Guilfoyle. Her body was not found until several months later, but her disappearance finally set off the alarm that somebody out there was abducting female hitchhikers. Young women began to hesitate to catch rides with strangers and began locking their doors. A local women's group loudly and angrily demanded greater police action. A tip line was established. Universities began to implore female students not to hitchhike, and if they must, to only get into cars with friends or into cars with the University of California staff sticker. Wow. Which, of course, Kemper already had on his car. Why would they not? Why would it not potentially be a staff member at the university? Why are they staff members at university somewhat suddenly more trustworthy than regular people? Why? That seems like a very strange thing to say. On January the 8th, 1973, nearly 4 months after his last murder, Kemper felt the overwhelming urge to kill again. The urge was exacerbated by his excitement at purchasing a Ruger .22 caliber pistol that same day. Quote, "It was on Mission Avenue. I was cruising around, close to 5 o'clock or so. I picked up 3 different girls that were possibilities, but I'd cancelled them out because there were too many people standing around that possibly knew them when they got in. But all the other conditions were perfect. Then it started raining real hard, and people were getting any ride they could get, and windows were fogging up. Nobody was paying any attention. I spotted her standing there with her thumb out, a large girl, 5'4" inches, maybe 160 pounds, straight, medium-length blonde hair, and very large-chested, breasted, I should say. This was 18-year-old Cabrillo College student Cynthia Ann Shaw, nicknamed Cindy. A keen student, she was unsure whether she wanted to be a high school teacher or a police officer. To support herself, Cindy had a babysitting job with a family downtown. She'd hitchhiked there and back. Kemper did not appear to be a threat with his university sticker and the fact Kemper's arm was in a cast. He had genuinely broken it in another car accident and was again suing for damages. Within minutes of Cindy Shaw climbing into his car, Kemper pulled the Ruger on her and proceeded to drive out of town towards Watsonville. Kemper pretended that he was suicidal and that he was sick of people walking away from him. This was just to convince Cindy that she might be able to talk him down and survive the situation, but in reality, this was just Kemper's way of ensuring Cindy's compliance with his demands. Quote, "I manipulated her to the point of resolving her behavior until we got to a place where she could be killed. And I had the biggest problem with that on a guilt basis because obviously that entailed unusual trust between the captor or the perpetrator and the victim of the crime. I was playing a little game. I convinced her that I didn't like guns and that I wasn't going to use it. I just nonchalantly tucked it away under my leg there and didn't refer to it again until later. I did everything but hand it to her to calm her down. Several times she asked me not to kill her, and I got to the point that my reassurances were very nonchalant. I was lying through my teeth." Quote ends. Kemper pulled into a wooded area near the small town of Freedom. There, Kemper told Cindy to climb into the trunk of the car. Quoting again, "She actually got into the trunk under her own power. I had a cast on my left arm. It was broken, and I walked her back to the trunk of the car where I told her that I was going to keep her undercover so I could get her to my home where we could talk. But I didn't want neighbors seeing her coming to the house or leaving the house, and I made that sound realistic to her. So she didn't want to get in the trunk, but she was willing to. When she got into the trunk, I shot her." When Kemper initially pulled the trigger, it clicked but it didn't fire. Cindy realized what was happening and scrambled to get back out of the trunk. Kemper pulled the trigger again and the gun fired. Cindy was killed instantly by the bullet entering her skull. To quote, "There was no jerk of the body. Every other case there had been a little jerk, little reflex. There was absolutely nothing. It amazed me so much because 1 second she's animated, the next second she's not, and there was absolutely nothing in between, just a noise and absolute stillness." Cindy's blood had splattered on Kemper's arm cast, which we covered with white shoe polish. He wrapped Cindy's body in a blanket and drove to his mother's house. Clarnell was not at home. Kemper carried the body into the house and threw it in the closet. Minutes later, his mother arrived home. They had a conversation, and then both of them went to bed. Kemper awoke the next morning and waited for Clarnell to leave for work. Kemper then proceeded to commit acts of necrophilia on Cindy's corpse. He then took the body to his mother's bathroom, dismembered it in the bathtub with the power saw that he'd stolen from the California Division of Highways. He decapitated the corpse and dug the .22 caliber bullet out of the skull. He placed Cindy's head in a box and returned it to his closet. Kemper placed the rest of Cindy's remains into plastic bags and drove to Monterey County, where he threw them off a cliff and into the ocean. He disposed of Cindy's belongings at a dump and tossed a jacket into a dryer at the local laundromat on full heat and left it there. The next day, an irritated owner pulled out the melted, ruined jacket and threw it in the trash. Kemper kept a small homemade ring of Cindy's for a while, but later flushed it down the toilet. Good plan there. Don't keep trophies. That's like, you're asking to get caught. Kemper kept Cindy's skull in a box in his closet for a day, periodically taking it out to perform necrotic fellatio and talk to it. Even at the time, Kemper was aware that having a conversation with a decapitated head was not the act of a sane person. Over the course of the next 24 hours, the pieces of Cindy's body washed back on shore. She was one of the first Kemper victims to be discovered. After hearing the news over the radio, Kemper grabbed a shovel and buried Cindy's skull in the garden. He made the skull face upward toward his mother's bedroom window because at the university, Clarnell had taken up the role of affectionate mother hen to all those college co-eds and, quote, mother always wanted people to look up to her. One hell of a tweak. Meanwhile, police had confused the disappearances of 3 young women and the murder of Cindy Schaal with the Santa Cruz slayings of Herbert Mullen. Okay, yeah, so you got 2 people killing the same group of people at the same time. California, it sounds so scary. Why is there so many killers in California?
Police abuse, rent control, pot, parks, seniors issues.
The previous year, on November the 2nd, 1972, Mullen stabbed a 64-year-old man to death. On January the 25th, 1973, Mullen committed 2 home invasions and shot 1 man, 2 women, and 2 young boys. The differences in age and sex of Mullen's victims provided a smokescreen for Kemper's MO. Police entertained the theory that there was a single predator in the Bay Area and that his victim profile was just entirely random. On February the 5th, 1973, not even a month had passed since Kemper had killed his last victim. Nevertheless, he began to feel the urge again to, quote, it was speeding up. It was coming to a head. It wasn't a cyclical thing. It was coming more often. This may well have had something to do with the fact Kemper had moved back in with his mother. Quoting again, my mother and I had a real tiff, and I told her I was going to a movie. I went straight to the campus because it was still early. I said, the first girl that's halfway decent that I pick up, I'm going to blow her brains out. Rosalind Thorpe was a 23-year-old student at UC Santa Cruz. She was nearly finished her degree. Rosalind had just exited her evening class and stuck out her thumb. It was raining. Quoting again, I said to myself, well, she's not bad looking. So I stopped. She hesitated. Then she saw the A tag and ran right along and hopped in. Basically, she carried the conversation. She was very outgoing, and I was just trying to be amicable. I was trying to decide if I was going to kill her. I had my little zap all through my body that confirmed it. I never had one of those where it didn't actually happen. It's where everything would click. Just right. Circumstances were perfect. She was not the least bit suspecting. We were talking, and she was more or less popping little questions here and there, talking along. Then I noticed Alice standing on the side of the road. She saw us coming, threw out a great big beautiful smile, and stuck out her thumb. This was Alice Liu, age 20, also a student at UC Santa Cruz. Quote, she was very good looking, built nicely and everything, and intelligent and moderate in her dress, nothing outlandish. I imagine she was a cautious hitchhiker and she always made sure of a ride before she got in. Rosalind and I appeared to be a couple, and with that A tag, Alice didn't hesitate at all about getting in. It surprised me, her being Oriental, that she was built like she was. Nothing fantastic, I mean, but you know, a very nice build. Anyway, she had long black hair, rather coarse, and a very square sort of face. Very wide, high cheekbones. Kemper and Rosalind started chatting while Alice sat quietly in the back seat. Kemper came to the crest of a hill near campus where the city lights twinkled below. Kemper asked Rosalind if she minded him slowing down so that he could look at the beautiful view. Rosalind said that she didn't mind. Alice piped up from the back seat and said she didn't mind also, but Kemper got the impression she was just being polite and was actually rather uneasy. And quoting again, we slowed down there almost to a stop. We were barely moving when I moved my pistol from under my leg. A solid black pistol. The interior of the car was dark, so they couldn't see it in my lap while I was talking to them. I just picked it up and pulled the trigger. Alice gasped as she saw the gun. Rosalind fell against the window, dead. The bullet lodged just above her left ear. Quote, she had a rather large forehead, and I was imagining what her brain looked like inside, and I just wanted to put the bullet right in the middle of that. Because Kemper's car was a 2-door sedan, Alice Liu was trapped in the back seat. She shielded her face with her hands and tried to duck into the corner of the car. Kemper fired 2 shots. The first went through her hand, the second missed. The bullets made 2 holes in the seat cushions. His third bullet hit Alice in the temple. Quoting again, she was making a very strange sound. I almost threw up as we were going down the hill. It was a sigh, a constant sigh, over and over. It would start out very sharp, almost like a sniffle. Then it would taper off and become more of a masculine side than the fine petite girl that she was. The blood started running, and she was, this is too much. This is too much. I don't need to hear about how a young person is dying. Let's just skip ahead. So there's a person dying in the backseat of his car. Kemper drove home, stopping the gas on the way, and lied to his mother, saying that he'd fallen asleep during the movie so he wouldn't have to remember the plot. Kemper then said he needed to go get cigarettes and went back outside, opened the trunk, and quickly decapitated both of the women in full view of the street. Kemper then went to a local bar, bought a packet of ciggies, had a drink, and went back home, watched TV, and fell asleep. The next morning, he carried Alice's body into his mother's house in broad daylight. Rosalind's body remained in the trunk. Kemper washed Alice's body in the tub and then laid it out on the bathroom floor and had sex with it. He cut off her hands and returned her remains to the trunk of the car, wrapping the bodies in a blanket. He then grabbed Rosalind's and Alice's heads, took them into the house, removed the bullets, and defiled the heads. He then placed them in the back of the car. That evening, Kemper drove to Alameda and visited his fiancée. To quote, "I was fairly agitated that night and she noticed it. My stomach was killing me. I thought I was developing ulcers because of all of this. I was in a great tension whenever something like this was happening, especially with people in the trunk of my car to dispose of." After leaving his fiancée, Kemper took himself to dinner and found that he could not eat. He then went to a movie. After that, he refueled his car at the gas station. Kemper then drove out of town towards Eden Canyon around 2 a.m. There, Kemper dumped the two headless bodies. He then drove across San Francisco and threw the heads and the hands of the two young women off a cliff and into the ocean. Quote, "It was easier to do. I was getting better at it. I was getting less detectable. I started flaunting that invisibility. Some people go crazy at that point. I felt it. It was one hell of a week." Lead us not into temptation. Then things moved quickly, and in a muddle that was advantageous to Kemper. The disappearance of Alice and Rosalind hit newspapers on February the 8th, 3 days after their murder. On February the 10th, the other Santa Cruz predator, Herbert Mullen, shot and killed 4 teenage boys at a makeshift campsite. On February the 11th, a woman's left hand was found. On the 13th, Mullen shot and killed his final victim, a 72-year-old man, before he was arrested by a highway patrolman. On the 14th, Alice and Rosalind's headless and handless bodies were found in Eden Canyon. All of these grisly events got lumped together in the police investigation. Herbert Mullen had killed a total of 13 people, and this included Kemper's own activities, and Kemper had left the police no trail that could lead back to him. All Kemper needed to do was now resist the temptation to kill again. Yeah, good luck with that. He's definitely going to kill again. This isn't something that he's just going to stop. In March, Kemper did not kill anyone, and he announced his engagement. He says during this month he resisted the temptation to murder any more co-eds in the way a person may resist the temptation to have a drink or smoke a cigarette. In early April, a police officer came by Clarnell's place when Kemper was there with his fiancée. Kemper had purchased a gun recently and had not declared that he had a criminal history on the form. Kemper pointed out his record had been expunged. The officer asked to see the gun in question. Kemper began taking the officer into Clarnell's house to fetch the gun from his closet. Then Kemper realized he had a bunch of other questionable guns in there, along with a bag of Alice and Rosalind's possessions. Kemper started to sweat. Then he remembered he had left the gun in question in the trunk of his car. Kemper quickly turned the officer back around. The officer confiscated the gun until the matter of its legality could be resolved and bid Kemper a nice day. Kemper felt sick. That was too close for comfort. Then on April the 14th, 1973, Kemper was driving along Asbury Avenue, the same road that he had abducted his first 2 victims. Quote, "I had a weapon in the car. I'm not hunting. I'm seeing if I can maintain and let this thing go and marry my young lady and move on. I go driving up there, and there's these 2 young ladies, 5'2", one dark-haired, one blonde-haired. They're in granny dresses, and I'm having fits, because it's like deja vu. They were just like my first 2 victims. They want to go to Mills College. We drive up Highway 13. We get to this clover leaf interchange. They wanted to go under the freeway and to the left. And I happened to know that a couple of miles down the road, there's a secluded spot where I took Anita Lucchesa and Mary Ann Pesh and killed them. Mills College was to the right, back towards downtown. The girls don't think so. They want to go the other direction. I'm saying, gee, you don't want to go that way. And I can't tell them why. They say, well, no, we go there. We would know. We live there. We want to go that way. And as we approach the interchange, I explain why they don't want to go that way. And I can't say because that's another step closer to you dying. If these urges take over, and if I go that way, it's not encouraging me to stop. It's testing me beyond where I want to test. I was actually scared to death I was going to kill them, and I'm trying to save their lives. Super, super deluded. Quote continues, I don't want them going that way because I know Mills College is the other way. They get scared shitless. Oh my god. We shouldn't have gotten in this guy's car. And they're all puckered up. And I say, just be patient. If I'm wrong, we'll turn off and take you right back your way. Trust me, please. And they couldn't talk. And they looked straight ahead. I had pushed it the other way and refused to take them the way they wanted to go. That's what scared them. The irony of it was, if I had gone their way, I would have said to myself, oops, let's kill them one more time. How do you oops to human lives? I don't know where they are today, and I don't know if they remember that little incident, but when I drove them to Mills College, right to their dormitory, they got out of that car and flew up those stairs, never even looked back. I don't think they know, to this day, how close they came. And that day, I knew I could not stop killing. I had no control over it. It was going to happen again, and between that weekend and the following week, I built an image in my head that my mother's going to die. I'm going to kill her, and I'm going to go to the police. We're going to hold court in the street, and they're going to pound me into the ground, and they can fill in the blanks, because I don't want to be around to explain it. All that week, it was a conviction that just got deeper and deeper in me. Almost every minute of every day, I knew that's what next weekend held. Dinner and a movie. After killing his mother, defiling her remains, and cleaning up the mess, Ed Kemper left the house. He went driving. While traveling down 41st Avenue, he spotted a friend, Robert McFadden. Kemper proposed they go get drunk together. It was still late morning. They proceeded to a liquor store. They sang some beers in the parking lot and then drove to a gun store where Kemper tried to purchase another gun but was refused by the owner due to the current legal confusion over Kemper's last purchase. At this point, Kemper and McFadden parted ways. Kind of impressed with the gun regulation here. That this is like back in the day. They didn't have like computers right to sort this stuff out, but somehow he's not getting a gun because they know about this legal confusion over the previous gun. That's cool. I like that. Kemper returned to Clarnell's house. He knew that his mother's absence would be noted on Easter Sunday, the next day, and it would also be suspicious if she did not turn up to work the next week. Quoting, I decided that someone else had to die too, a friend of hers, as a cover-up, an excuse. I started thinking about who would be the best victim, who would be the most available, who would be the easiest to kill, and who would be most likely to leave with my mother for a spur-of-the-moment trip. Kemper decided upon Clarnell's best friend, 59-year-old Sally Hallett. He called her number and got no answer. He tried again several more times that afternoon. All the while, Kemper was drinking more beer, trying to keep down the rising sense of panic. Sally called at 5 p.m. and asked Ed if she could speak to his mother. Kemper replied that his mother was not at home, but that she should come over at 7:30 p.m. to join Clarnell and him for dinner and a movie. Sally leapt at this invitation. Kemper then closed all the windows and doors in the house so that the sound of Sally's screams would not carry. He brought a rope and a makeshift bludgeon into the living room. He placed a gun in the adjoining bedroom, just in case. Sally arrived, late, at 8 p.m. Kemper greeted her at the door. He told Sally that his mother was also running late. Sally accepted this explanation, and the two went into the living room together. Quoting again, we were crossing the living room toward the couch. My first intention was to strike at her midsection, her solar plexus, and knock the wind out of her so she could not cry out, and then to strangle her. It was the first move that I was kind of dreading. I guess what worked me into it was that she said, let's sit down. I'm dead. And I kind of took her at her word there. I hit her hard, and she dumped back and said, stop that. I hit her again immediately, and her last words were, oh, and then she stumbled back. I threw my left arm around her neck. I put her in a chokehold and pulled her up off the floor. In fact, she was dangling across my chest with absolutely no sounds coming from her. She was holding my arm with both her hands. There was no real tugging. Her legs weren't really kicking at all. I thought at the time that she was so shocked and so embarrassed at what had just happened that she couldn't really say anything and was just waiting for me to make a move. I looked down into her face. Her eyes were bulging badly. Her face was turning from a bright red to black. Later on, I realized that I had crushed her larynx. When she went limp, I dropped her to the floor. Kemper dumped Hallett's body in his closet alongside his mother. He removed all the money Sally and Clarnell had on them and stole their credit cards. On the corpse of his mother, Kemper left behind a note for police which read, approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents, just a lack of time. I got things to do. So he's kind of trying to make a really diversion. This is really... And also, if someone's mother and best friend are murdered and the son has previously got a double murder for killing family members, bro, the police are going to be looking into you so hard, and if they're not, what the Kemper left the house and drove to the jury room. He spent an hour there drinking beer. He then returned home and slept in his mother's bed for 6 hours. On Easter Sunday, Kemper moved all of his guns and his possessions to Sally Hallett's car. At 10 a.m., Kemper drove out of town. He drove eastward all the way to Reno, Nevada. There he dumped Hallett's car and transferred all of his guns and belongings to a rental car. Kemper continued to drive east, stopping only at a gas station for gas, soft drinks, and some caffeine pills to stay awake. After 18 hours of driving, Kemper was pulled over in Colorado for speeding. He was fined $25, and he kept on driving, long into Monday night. Despite Kemper's determination to flee, his fatigue, and his growing sense of paranoia that he was already the subject of a manhunt, he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Kemper claims this was entirely due to his mother's death. Yeah, like we said earlier, it'd be better if you'd killed her earlier on, and maybe that would have satisfied your bloodlust, because obviously she's the real problem here. Here I'm encouraging him to kill his mother. At the beginning, we were like, oh no, he's killing his mother. And now it's like, oh, maybe it would have been for the best. Oh, God. Kemper arrived in Pueblo, Colorado after a 1,000-mile or 1,600-kilometer journey without sleep. He listened to the radio and found that there was not yet any news of Clarnell and Sally's murders. Indeed, they were still undiscovered in Kemper's closet back home. It was at that point Kemper decided to turn himself in. Quote, the original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any real or physical or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. Toward the end there, I started to feel the folly of the whole damn thing. And at the point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I said to hell with it, and called it all off. He telephoned the Santa Cruz Police Department in the middle of the night, knowing that he could not wait until morning. He confessed to the murder of his mother and her friends, but the desk officer thought it was a garden variety nutcase and told him to call back another time. Kemper called the Santa Cruz Police Department again the following morning. This time he asked for an officer he knew from the jury room. He confessed to killing his mother and Sally Hallett again, and he waited for 2 Colorado officers to arrive and arrest him. Thereupon, he confessed to murdering the 6 college co-eds. On the long drive back to California, Kemper and the arresting officers stopped off at a drive-thru. There, a group of young women passed by the car. Kemper's involuntary response was to vomit all over himself. A talkative murderer. Kemper was kept in police custody in Santa Cruz and questioned about all 8 murders that he had committed in 1972 and 1973. He spoke for several hours, confessing in great detail. On May the 7th, 1973, Kemper was indicted for all 8 murders. At the initial hearing, he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Kemper tried to kill himself twice while in prison awaiting trial. Adding his grandparents, Kemper had murdered a total of 10 people. On 23rd of October 1973, his trial began. They had death penalty? I don't think so, right? When was Manson? When was the Manson stuff? Because he was spared the death penalty. I get the feeling it was... Maybe it was later than this. But he's still alive, isn't he, Kemper? The jury heard testimony from 3 court-appointed psychologists that Kemper was sane. This was based on the McNaughton rule, which disallowed any plea of insanity where the perpetrator had an awareness of what he was doing, showed malice afterthought, and knew what he was doing was criminal. I have a feeling that's a law in British law as well. If I'm not mistaken, it's super familiar to me. Maybe it's that old. Kemper was judged sane by all 3 criteria. His alleged insanity was the result of his congenital psychopathy, his complex created by his mother's years of abuse, and by a sexual and sadistic urge to kidnap and murder co-eds in order to possess their bodies. I'll leave it to the listener to determine whether they think that Kemper should have been sentenced to prison or to another hospital for the criminally insane. Prison. I know we said we'd leave it to the audience, David, but he needs to go to prison. He needs to go. It's prison time. Or like a proper never get out psychiatric hospital, because he'll just manipulate people into getting out and then he'll kill people again, because that's what he does. He can't resist it. For their part, the jury clearly thought that Kemper was not crazy, just a monster. On November the 8th, 1973, after just 5 hours of deliberation, they found Kemper sane and guilty on all 8 counts of murder. Kemper requested the death penalty, going further to request death by torture for what he had done. However, Kemper's conviction fell during the time in US history when the death sentence was suspended. As such, he was given 7 years to life for each count of murder to be served concurrently. He was sent to prison in Vacaville, California, where he remains to this day. While Kemper was incarcerated, he bullied fellow Santa Cruz predator Herman Mullins, who Kemper found to be an arrogant and remorseless killer. Kemper himself soon became a model prisoner. He cooperated with the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, and that's what that TV show Mindhunter's all about, in giving insights in the mind and practices of serial killers. In this sense, Kemper is the real-life Hannibal Lecter and a pioneer of the practice of criminal profiling. Kemper also gave many interviews to journalists and documentarians over the years, many of which can be found on YouTube. Kemper was first eligible for parole in 1979, only 6 years after his arrest. He was denied. The same went for his parole hearings in 1980, 81, 82. Despite Kemper's good behavior and self-aware accounting for his crimes, along with his evident remorse for them, the parole board did not trust that he would not be a danger to society if released. Good, parole board, you're bang on, he would not be. The conclusion was partially coloured by how effectively Kemper had fooled the psychologists at Atascadero State Hospital after the murder of his grandparents in 1964, earning his early release and expunging of his juvenile record. It is also quite clear that Kemper is a manipulative psychopath, possibly incapable of feeling the empathy for his victims that he claims to feel, and his protestations that his desire to murder has ended with the death of his mother may not be entirely honest ones. Yeah, totally agree. I do think that was probably a turning point, but also we absolutely cannot trust him, and he will probably murder again. He should definitely be in prison forever. Kemper continued to be rejected in all of his parole hearings in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. He also waived his right to a hearing on several occasions. Kemper has claimed that he's quite happy to live and die in prison. In 1988, he also said, quote, "Society is not ready for me in any way, shape, or form. I can't fault them for that." So that implies that at some point society is going to be ready for you, Ed, which they're not. They never would be, because society isn't that. It's just not that. Other times, however, Kemper has made attempts to secure his release. He's next eligible for parole in 2024. He'll be 75 years old. Whether or not the old man would kill and mutilate again, should he encounter any young, vulnerable women, is open to speculation. I'd say, yeah, probably. Probably. It's not something it doesn't seem like it's something you can turn off. Dismembered appendices. 1. While awaiting trial in 1973, Kemper was subjected to some quote-unquote truth serum, where he admitted to committing acts of cannibalism, where he cooked the flesh of his victims in a casserole. Kemper later recanted that confession. Number 2. Kemper is a direct inspiration for both Buffalo Bill and Hannibal Lecter in the movie Silence of the Lambs. Yeah. Number 3. In 2017 and 2019, Kemper was masterfully depicted by Cameron Britton in the TV series Mindhunter, the theme song of which I've been listening to multiple times during the writing of the script for inspiration. It's a good theme song. It's a good show. You should check the show out for sure. And Cameron Britton, I didn't know the actor before, but he does a great job. Number 4. In the movie American Psycho, the villain/anti-hero Patrick Bateman incorrectly attributes a Kemper quote to Wisconsin murderer and skin-suit enthusiast Ed Gein. Kemper's quote is as follows: "When I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her out, talk to her, be real nice and sweet and treat her right. The other part wonders what her head might look like on a stick." And that quote is where we end today's pretty brutal episode, where I jumped over bits of parts because it was just too brutal. Ed Kemper, though, what did you expect? Very long. Oh my lord, very, very long. Anyway, thank you for watching or listening. If you enjoy, in inverted commas, inverted quotes, this show, please do leave a review. If you're watching on YouTube, please thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.